Chapter 691. In fact, after leaving Ampere Seal, the Elemental Activation quest had been put on Brando's agenda. Because since entering the Elemental Activation stage, all his experience bars had been locked into gray. Such a state in the Amber Sword meant that players had to unlock the Elemental Activation quest before they could further level up. But that was only one of the reasons. The real reason why he came here was because of the information he got from Lorena. The Stained Frost Forest Labyrinth was extremely famous in Erewhon in the past game, whether it was the labyrinth itself or the famous Winter Dragon in the labyrinth. This dungeon was one of the few legendary dungeons in Erewhon, and the so-called legendary dungeons themselves were dungeons that allowed guild-level teams of hundreds of people to enter. Before the release of the third version, there was only one such dungeon in each civilized area, one, outside of the Black Forest. It represented the highest honor of a team challenge in the earlier era in Brando's memory, so the difficulty of the dungeon was imaginable. Although Brando had long expected to meet the young dragon on the Falling Needle Hills Avenue, he didn't expect the opportunity to descend in front of him so soon. To be honest, if it weren't for the fear that Erek would really get the heart of the dragon in front of him, he really didn't want to go to the Stained Frost Forest Labyrinth so early. The Stained Frost Forest Labyrinth itself was a black forest in a civilized land, and it was almost of the highest level, a place where the laws were tilted. Or rather, the Twilight Scar, an existence similar to the Saint's Legacy and the Fairy Village, which were diametrically opposed to the Order. As a player of Erewhon, Brando was naturally very familiar with this dungeon. The existence of the Stained Frost Forest started in the era of the Twilight Battle. After the fall of Babel Fortress, the Frostweaver Milos fled south with the Myurnas. After 7 days and 7 nights of pursuit, the Alpha Wolf Ekis caught up with the giant god at the border of the Winter Kingdom, and then an earth-shattering battle broke out. It was written in the Pale Poem, Ekis bit Milo's neck and the giant father was torn apart. Its huge body seemed to turn into a brilliant star, falling to the east, north and south. The place where the giant star fell to the ground immediately ignited a raging flame, but the flame had no temperature but a rising ice flame. Legend had it that a fragment of the giant god Milos fell to the south and landed in present-day Viro, forming the eternal frozen Black Forest. Even if it was located in the central area of Marsh's blessed land, it could not be assimilated for a long time. In fact, in the game the Stained Frost Forest was almost the source of all the monsters and players' quests in Viro. Although Brando had a lot of friends in his previous life, he didn't join any large guilds before the fall of Erewhon. It was nothing more than a small group with a few seniors. A team like theirs naturally had no fate with a legendary dungeon like the Stained Frost Forest Labyrinth, but even so, they still experienced the perverted nature of this dungeon in the periphery. In his memory it was when the dungeon was first opened. All the players of Erewhon went to experience it, and their team was no exception. However, just like most players, a party like theirs had bumped into a huge obstacle before they even entered the dungeon. That was the baby dragon. The door god with the bloodline of the Golden Folk. Because it liked the cold climate, it entrenched itself near the Stained Frost Forest and blocked all players who tried to enter the forest. To be honest, it was difficult for the average player to imagine the power of the Dragon Clan before that. And the game designer gave all players a chance to accumulate experience in this event. The so-called baby dragon. In fact, Brando also understood that Allah's was a ready-made example. Let the players of that era or even most of the players who had not yet elemental activation have to face a little female dragon, the consequences could be imagined. Brando didn't even want to recall the details of the battle because there were no details to speak of. To put it simply, we came, we saw and we fell. And this was just the old man guarding the door. Because of this, Brando urgently needed to activate his elemental activation first. Although the legendary dungeon represented the peak of team dungeon difficulty in an era, it had its limitations after all. Once the elemental activation was completed, the difficulty of the dungeon would naturally decrease geometrically. After all, it was a dungeon before elemental activation, and the design idea also had its limitations. While thinking about these trivial things, Brando walked to the center of the stone tablet array. In theory, once a player in the game walked to the center of the stone array, the quest system would immediately activate. Just like when he was in the Eternal Song Forest and the Forbidden Orchard, he immediately received a system prompt. But what made Brando slightly startled was that he waited for a little while. Except for the whistling wind in the mountains, the surroundings were silent. What's going on? Brando's heart began to panic. In theory, he had already touched the elemental wall. If he was an indigenous person, he should have already activated his elemental activation without even needing a quest. Because for the indigenous people, elemental activation was almost synonymous with elemental activation, and the rest was just the accumulation of attributes and experience. But to say that his attributes should have already been enough or even exceeded it, and his experience had already been locked. This should be a sign of preparing to unlock the elemental activation quest in any way. But the problem was, he had never heard of a player who could not receive a quest in the stone array after meeting all the conditions. Moreover, there was no second way to obtain the elemental activation quest in the game. The cold wind in the mountains blew, and in just a moment Brando's forehead was already covered in cold sweat. Many possibilities flashed through his mind for a moment, the most terrifying of which was undoubtedly that as a transmigrator, he might not be able to activate his elemental activation at all. At the thought of this, even with Brando's current psychological quality, he could not help but turn a little pale. If he could not activate his elemental activation and continue to level up, his dream of saving this kingdom and setting history on a different path would be nothing more than a bubble. In this world, no matter the situation, strength was first and foremost. But he closed his eyes and took a gentle breath to calm himself down. Although this possibility could not be ruled out, it seemed unlikely. Because if a soul from another world was incompatible with the laws of this world, then he might not have been able to come into contact with any elemental power before. But he already had a part of the elemental power, didn't he? Brando stood there blankly for a moment, then suddenly remembered something. He hurriedly opened his character panel, but all the attributes on the character panel were the same. He frowned and flipped through the pages. Suddenly, his eyes lit up slightly. His gaze stopped on the character log. At the bottom of the log, there was a line of small green text. Authority unlocking conditions not met. Authority unlocking conditions not met? Brando saw this line of text and froze for a moment. What kind of hint was this? Authority unlocking conditions not met? He knew very well that all his conditions should have met the criteria for elemental activation. There was no way that the unlocking conditions were not met. What the hell is going on? Brando couldn't help but frown. Could this be the legendary bug? However, this question seemed a bit ridiculous. Not to mention that the chances of encountering a bug in the Amber Sword were almost lower than being struck by lightning. And even if he encountered a bug now, where would he go to find the game manager to solve the problem? Brando couldn't help but feel a headache when he thought of this problem. He couldn't help but knock on his head and began to calculate the differences between himself and the average player. The biggest difference was nothing more than two. One was his own elite template, and the other was the Planeswalker system. But the elite template also existed in the game, and it didn't seem to have much to do with the elemental power and the laws themselves. He first ruled out this possibility, but the remaining Planeswalker system gave him a headache. To be honest, although the Planeswalker system had always been his biggest reliance, he had never figured out the thing itself. How did it come about? Did it also exist in the game? What was the principle of its operation? Brando only learned a few words of information from Tumen, the Stag Banshee, and Saint Tassol. Although part of this information explained the history and origin of the Planeswalker, to be honest, the three of them probably didn't know where the Planeswalker came from. Not to mention figuring out the principle of its existence. He thought for a while but couldn't figure it out. But when he thought of the name Saint Tassol, he finally remembered that there was another existence in his body that knew about the Planeswalker just like him. He hurriedly called out in his heart, "Lord Saint Tassol." Woo 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 woo. A confused voice was heard. The voice seemed to hesitate for a moment, then suddenly became clear. "Brando? Didn't I say I need to catch up on sleep at this time every day?" There was a hint of sternness in the voice. Brando hurriedly coughed. The legendary Great Sage was not a good-tempered existence, especially when this elf had repeatedly warned him not to disturb her to catch up on sleep. According to her own words, lack of sleep was the #1 enemy of beauty. But with Martha above, the heroic spirit didn't seem to need to care about this. Of course he wouldn't unwisely say this out loud. He could only smile and say, "Lord Saint Tassol, I have encountered a little trouble." Little trouble? The Wind Empress voice was startled. She had accompanied Brando for a long time, and she rarely heard him talk about his troubles. She pondered for a moment and asked, "Is it about the Planeswalker?" Brando was really shocked by this elf. "How did you know?" "Humph," the Wind Empress lightly snorted. "You are a freak. You have a lot of knowledge that even I don't know. It seems that the only thing that can confuse you is the inheritance of the Planeswalker." She paused for a moment and continued, "Tell me, what trouble have you encountered?" Brando hurriedly explained his predicament. Of course he skipped the part about the elemental activation task. After all, it was really difficult to explain. It was like trying to explain to the Shire what a cabbage that didn't exist in this world was. He changed to a more euphemistic way and told the Wind Empress that he had encountered a little trouble on the road to elemental activation. You mean you can't touch the elemental wall, maybe because you are a planeswalker? The Wind Empress quickly listened to Brando's explanation, but immediately asked, "Why haven't I heard of the Darkness Dragon Odin having this problem?" "How would I know?" Brando spread his hands helplessly. "Wait." The elf seemed to have caught the center of gravity. "Do you have your own deck?" "This?" Brando thought for a moment and replied seriously, "I think I have one." "Then you're really an idiot." Saint Tassol suddenly asked fiercely, "Brando, you woke me up for such a stupid thing? I thought you were a smart guy." "Wait," Brando reacted at this time. "Wind Empress, what do you mean? You mean if I want to elemental activation I have to have my own deck of cards?" "Nonsense." The Elf Empress used her unique charming voice and concisely ended the discussion with Brando. "To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 692. Elemental Energy is a Law. If you can't control your own power, how can you reach the realm of elemental energy? To put it simply, you have to be at least an official planeswalker to continue on this path. I was already curious. Brando, you've only been using other people's cards. At best you're an apprentice. How can you reach the level of elemental energy? Saint Tassol looked at him doubtfully. A possibility flashed through Brando's mind. It might be because he had two souls in one body. As one half of Sophie had inherited the legacy of a planeswalker, and the other half of Brando had inherited the bloodline of the Darkness Dragon. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that it was possible. His thick eyebrows couldn't help but raise. "Then what should I do?" he asked. "Lady Saint Tassol. How would I know? I'm not a planeswalker." The elven lady shrugged and glared at Brando. "But you, as an apprentice of a planeswalker, why do you always act like a dabbler? Do all planeswalkers teach their apprentices like this? No wonder there are fewer and fewer inheritors of this legacy." Brando didn't know whether to laugh or cry. When he first opened the elemental pool, Tumen only told him the origin of this legacy and the history of how the Matatanians used this ability. Now that he thought about it, time was tight at the time. The Elemental Emperor might have only taught him a rudimentary skill to deal with terse pursuit. After all, he had to be alive to have the possibility of learning future knowledge. Later, in Kelsey's tomb, the dear Demoness taught him advanced combat skills. Although she also talked about the importance of pursuing one's own power, she didn't go into too much detail. In the end, it seemed that the Wind Empress wasn't wrong. On the path of a planeswalker, he looked like a dabbler no matter how he looked at it. But Brando thought for a moment and said, "Well, actually I'm not completely clueless. Yes. Tumen once told me, perfecting the rules of the world begins with the creation of your own basic deck. He said, actually, from the moment you come into contact with the first card of fate, you have already revealed your own deck. My deck is Tyrant of all classes." Brando said the term awkwardly. Fortunately, the Wind Empress did not notice it at all. She only looked at Brando with a deep gaze. "So your inheritance came from that guy?" Brando nodded. "It seems that I have misinterpreted his meaning. I opened the path of a knight from the very beginning, but after that, I didn't continue on this path. Instead, I blindly enriched the world. Are you able to recognize that now?" The Wind Empress raised her eyebrows slightly. "It seems that you should have noticed something after I used that shameless woman to talk to you, right?" Brando was sweating profusely. Of course, he knew that the shameless woman Saint Tassol was talking about was the dear Demoness Elaine. He coughed and said, "More or less, so I have a rough idea of how to become an official planeswalker." "What do you plan to do?" Saint Tassol asked. Brando was silent for a moment. Although this was a decision he had made long ago during the Battle of Ampere Seal, when it really came down to it, he was still a little unwilling. After all, it was a very painful thing to give up the power that he had already obtained. But one path could lead to the highest peak, and the other path had already reached the peak. Brando knew what he should choose. "I think now I want to go back to the original path. I want to become an apprentice again and then form my own law." "I see." The Wind Empress had a slightly appreciative look in her eyes. "It seems that you are still the Brando I know. You have not been blinded by power." She paused and asked, "So, do you plan to do it now?" "Of course, Freya is still waiting for me up there." Brando replied, and then he waved his hand. At that moment, it was as if a world as deep as the universe had formed behind him. This scene was exactly the same as when Brando met Tumen that day, but his world was far less stable and vast than the Elemental Emperor's. It was as if it could envelop the entire world. Countless colorful lights flew out from this world. Silver Card Unicorn Knight, Medisha. Island Mage the Shire. Holy Archangel. Sunblade. Golden Battle Flag. One by one the cards that belonged to him appeared in front of him. They were arranged in an orderly manner like stars. And further away in Castle Abes in the Gars River, in the forests of Port Gris and the Maxon area. The apprentices in the Mage Tower suddenly realized that the Shire on the podium had disappeared without a trace. The tree elves who were talking to their commander lost sight of the Silver Fairy Princess in the next moment. Mephistopheles realized that Andrique in front of him was turning into nothingness. As soon as he stood up, he disappeared with the vampire's daughter in front of everyone's eyes. And everywhere in Abes, the mercenaries of Lopez became transparent one by one. They looked at each other and then seemed to melt under the sun. Echelonious spell weavers, glorious trumpeters, fireclaw lizardmen. The contractors who responded to Brando's summons gathered in front of Brando at the same time. Brando looked at them one by one. The Shire and Medisha, although they were on the cards, they were so lifelike that it was as if they could feel his gaze. And behind Brando, a small world formed by the Sacred Tree secret grounds, the market of the Shire of Ro, the Ruggen Swamp, the Ember Volcano, and the Storm Nest were floating in the void. This small world seemed to represent all of Brando's power. Saint Tassol the Wind Empress looked at this scene silently. She couldn't help but sigh in her heart. This was the power of a planeswalker. Even though he was just an apprentice, he had already mastered the core rules of this world, having his own world. And going one step further, they would truly become the masters of the world. Sometimes she didn't understand why there were planeswalkers in this world. They seemed to be outside of Martha's rules, but they didn't attract the attack of Martha's Tiamat law. Their identities and origins were an eternal mystery. What was the meaning of their existence? She squinted at all of this. But Brando had already made his final preparations. He waved his hand. The small world shattered with a bang. He frowned slightly. It was as if he could see his elemental pool collapsing into nothingness. The power of countless elements mixed together and converged into a point, as if it was the center of the universe. But in the darkest depths, energy, time, and space converged into a point, nurturing infinite power. All of the cards scattered in the air like trash. My lord, quickly stabilize your power. You can't control us anymore. Medisha's voice came from the air. My lord, stay calm. This was the Shire's words. I believe in you. Brando nodded. He stretched out his hands, and the deep space behind him seemed to be expanding infinitely, forming a universe that was being nurtured anew. He said calmly, I rule that this law will be born from this. The glorious knight trekked through the wilderness of Libusa with a bugle flag in his hand. The wind and dust didn't stain his determined face. His will was as tough as a blade. This is the Knight of Fran, glorifying him and his followers with holy power. He should first have a territory, Brando said. The Shire's market fell into his hands like gold falling from the sky. It fell into the dark universe and immediately formed a prosperous land. Plants grew luxuriantly on the golden soil. First, meadows grew out of the soil, then trees grew branches, and in the blink of an eye, green trees grew into shade. Then the migrating travelers came, and humans cut down trees to build a city. In the blink of an eye, a small town full of traffic appeared in front of Brando and Saint Tassol. Then the gem plain formed a rich land in front of the town. The water gurgled as if it could bring wealth from the distant sky. The nest of storms formed the background and the distant mountains stretched. This scene seemed familiar, but it was particularly different for Brando. Presumably, with the power given to him by Tumen, he had finally arrived at the call of the power of the law. It wasn't a world created by the planeswalker himself. It was Martha's approval. Brendel's heart trembled. What he said was Fran's knight. His favorite knight in the Amber Sword was different from other knights who were either good at defense or good at offense. Fran's knight had a balanced ability to attack, retreat, and defend. He also had divine abilities. He wasn't as fast as a warrior or as strong as a priest, but he perfectly embodied the profession of knight. Fran's knight shared glory with his followers. He first set the market of the Shire's Shire, the Gem Plain, and the Nest of Storms as the source of the knight's power, and then continued, he should have followers. Followers, this was the core ability of Fran's knight. Fran's knight gained the ability to summon at level 15, allowing him to summon a team of followers on the battlefield. Whenever the Fran's knight leveled up, these followers also leveled up. Fran's knight wasn't good at offense, but as a standard aura and command role, he was very good at teamwork. Brando looked up. A card was then drawn. The Mercenaries of Lopez. But this familiar card completely changed in Brando's eyes. First of all, it became a silver rare grade card, and its attributes were also greatly changed. Other than the familiar pattern, even the name had been completely changed. White City Vanguard Eversong I win 5, spell instant, pay 20 mana, knight. The Fran's knight issued a call and placed a team of 12 Mercenaries of Lopez into the field. Maintain the Mercenaries of Lopez, white derivative equivalent to Fran's knight level -10, will be maintained until the next day's reset. Since the 172nd year of the First Era, the Mercenaries of Lopez have been known for their bravery and outstanding loyalty. Although this card was chosen by Brando himself, when he saw this card, he couldn't help but blurt out. He stared at the pattern on the card. The images of the Nightsong Tiger and Falerne sisters were very clear, but this card was obviously no longer the Mercenaries of Lopez. What's going on? Brando never dreamed that a card that originally belonged to the City-States Alliance would inexplicably be added to Eversong. Moreover, the cost was greatly reduced, but it became a summoning magic card. He was slightly startled, and at the same time, he suddenly heard Saint Tassol's voice in his heart. At that moment, Brando also felt the fluctuation of energy at the same time. Both of them raised their heads at the same time. A 7-colored light suddenly shook in front of Brando, and a light door opened from it. This scene was familiar. Brando was about to call out that name, but a man in a silver robe had already walked out from behind the door. I said we will meet again. When you officially become a planeswalker. Brando. Tumen. Before Brando could even open his mouth, the Wind Empress had already called out. P.S. The 7th day. A champion who updates 10,000 times a day. Also, continue to ask for attention on Weibo. Asking for fans. Eternal Flame FF. This is my Weibo ID. I recommend Fathead Fish's book. The last time I called him Dumbhead Fish, he was not satisfied. Okay, actually this guy's real name is Yong Tai 6 Britannia. No, it's Silver Ash Frost. Actually, it's almost the same, anyway it's the same Chinibyu. The title of the book is Heart Hunting King's Power. It complements the author's ID. Book number 2268766. His introduction was too poorly written, so I decided to help him write a new one. This book tells the story of a Marxist materialist and a group of capitalist mages fighting a battle of wits and courage. Okay, that's Kyuso. Those who like psionic war mages can read this book. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 693. Before Brando could stop her, Saint Tassol the Wind Empress had already left the ring on his hand. It was as if a shadow had materialized beside him. As soon as she landed on the ground, she stared at the young man with black hair and red eyes who walked out from behind the door of light. She called out his name with certainty. Tumen. Tumen paused. Saint Tassol? The young man in a silver robe's red eyes suddenly lit up. Heroic spirit? The Moon Legacy? You also chose this little guy. It seems that my taste is not bad. Saint Tassol's slender brows furrowed slightly. She stared at the figure in front of her suspiciously. Tumen, you're not dead? Tumen smiled and spread his hands. My student, 1,000 years have passed. When we meet again after 1,000 years, is this still the first thing you care about? Brando stood aside and watched this scene. Historically, Tumen was a follower of the Darkness Dragon and had a relationship with the Four Sages. But according to historical records, Saint Tassol was indeed his student. Before the War of the Holy Saints, Tumen had taught the secrets of magic to all intelligent creatures and left precious knowledge like the sacred pattern. Seriously speaking, Gretel, Saint Tassol, and Fanzan of the Four Sages had a teacher-student relationship with Tumen. But Saint Tassol did not recognize this teacher. She looked at him coldly. In my opinion, this is not boring at all. Tumen, we worked so hard 1,000 years ago to achieve everything. I don't want to start all over again. Tumen smiled indifferently. My student, for 1,000 years, Gretel built the Cruz Empire on the Great Plains. How is his holy cathedral of fire today? What is the difference between the Cruz people today and the Erewhon people of the past? You built the holy cathedral of the Wind Empress, but your subordinates turned around and betrayed you. Where are the once glorious mist elves today? Among all of you, I admire Fanzan the most. But how many people still adhere to his doctrine today? The glory of White City is long gone. Your descendants are now killing each other for superficial interests. Compared to that dark age, today's world is nothing. Everyone has a dark side in their hearts. Gretel and I didn't build these kingdoms to make them last forever. What you can foresee, we've foreseen as well. Gretel's face sank slightly. Everyone has a dark side to them. It's just that you've also discovered that there needs to be a centralized country on this land in order to solve some problems. Back then, when you split it into 4, it doesn't seem like a wise choice. Tumen did not show any anger in the face of the Wind Empress' rebuke. He only replied softly. If you don't try, there won't be any results, Tumen. Tumen raised his eyebrows and asked, then what was the answer you got? Your soul is still lingering on a ring, lingering bitterly. What? History has already moved forward. Why are you still standing where you are? Saint Tossol choked and fell silent. Is he the one you chose, Saint Tossol? But Tumen did not seem to intend to continue forcing her. Instead, he turned to look at Brando and asked, isn't he also the one you chose? The Wind Empress replied snappily. Her angry look made Brando very curious. He had only seen this great sage's confident and strong side. He had never seen her act like a child. Not only that, Saint Tossol quickly recovered and snorted coldly, your old boss, the Darkness Dragon Odin, and Kelsey also took a fancy to him. This little guy is not simple. Gretel's Scepter of Fire seems to have decided to choose him as its master. Before the great era comes, heroes are born. This is not strange. Only after experiencing an era can one see the future clearly. Tumen replied. You think too highly of him. The elf's expression was slightly sunken. I don't have as many complicated thoughts as you. I just want to find a successor. Tumen glanced at her and smiled but did not say anything. However, he did not intend to expose her. Instead, he looked at the newly born thin world of laws behind Brando. Around Brando, the cards of fate that belonged to him floated in the air and formed a circle. Ever since the Knight class was established, the world behind him had stabilized. The cards of fate that were originally scattered around no longer showed any signs of escaping his control. Brando, you reached this step faster than I thought. I thought you would need at least some time to understand the true meaning of power. Tumen could not help but praise after watching for a while. Hearing Tumen's words, Brando could not help but blush no matter how thick-skinned he was. If not for the dear Demoness telling him the true meaning of a planeswalker's power, he would probably still be addicted to power that did not belong to him. Saint Tossol clearly knew the inside story and could not help but snort softly. You flatter me, Lord Tumen. I have only recently understood these principles. Brando sighed. In fact, he really understood the unreliability of power that did not belong to him in the Battle of Ampere Seal. The experience of being pulled into the ultimate realm in the battle with Williams and almost being completely overturned was still vivid in his mind. It seems that you have encountered a lot of things. Tumen smiled gently, but these are not bad things. Whether the results are good or bad, the value of experience is the same for anyone. Moreover, it seems that you did not suffer much in these incidents. This is really just a fluke, Brendel thought to himself sadly. However, these were not his main concerns now. He was most concerned about the issue of the Planeswalker class change. After all, this was related to whether he could activate his elemental powers. He pondered for a moment and asked, Lord Tumen, are you here to reorganize my cards? More or less. Tumen nodded. You should now understand that the blueprint of the deck I set for you that day was only based on the understanding of your own world. But after all, it is not your own law. If you want to become a true Planeswalker, you must turn what I gave you into knowledge that truly belongs to you. Just like these cards? Brando looked at the White City Vanguard in the deck and said, Exactly. Tumen praised. Then what should I do next? He asked again. Don't you already have an idea in mind? You just have to follow your own ideas and do it. I am only here to tell you some of the laws that a true Planeswalker must abide by when you become an official Planeswalker. Tumen replied, As an apprentice, because he uses the power of others, the laws are far looser on him, but he will never be able to reach the ultimate realm. And once you become an official Planeswalker, you will soon understand the true meaning of this inheritance. The true meaning of a Planeswalker. Brando looked up. Just like what Tumen had said, ever since the battle in Ampere Seal, he had thought about his own deck countless times and now he had a rough framework. Although it was not to the extent of being detailed to every aspect, it was no problem to create this deck. So Brando nodded and said aloud, What belongs to a knight belongs to a knight. As soon as his voice fell, a silver light flashed in mid-air, and the cards fell one after another. As soon as the sun blade fell, it immediately turned into a silver hymn. In the Amber Sword, hymn was a basic skill of the Fran Knight. This was a special buff skill. It allowed the Fran Knight to sing him on the battlefield to destroy the undead and monsters, and at the same time generate a shield to resist black magic damage on his allies. This brand new card in Brando's eyes looked like this. Him Evernight I Light 2, spell, pay XMP Knight lower level, the Fran Knight sings him, dealing X points of damage to non-white creatures, monsters, undead. At the same time, place X counters on each friendly creature, and remove 1 counter for each point of damage from black spells. O glorious holy temple, look at the pure white flames descending from the heavens, covering the army like a pair of wings. Then came the parallel charge, which became the group charge of the Fran Knight. Group charge Evernight IV Earth 2, spell, pay 1 glory. The Fran Knight allows his followers to gain the group ability. Maintain. The group charge will be maintained until the reset time of the next day. I saw it with my own eyes. The Sabri people charged with a scream, and an army of tens of thousands collapsed in front of them, Baron Vassar and Caden. Group ability, when creatures with the same ability within a certain range receive a 1% damage bonus. For every additional creature with this ability, the damage will increase by an additional amount. Next was the Golden Battle Flag, Silver Colt, and Holy Sword. They became Encourage, Cavalry Readiness, and Heaven's Armor respectively. Encourage Evernight V-Light 5, spell, pay half MP Knight. The Fran Knight encourages all allies to level up, current level +5. Maintain. Encourage will be maintained until the reset time of the next day. My glory is your glory. Cavalry Readiness Evernight VI Earth 1, spell, pay XMP. The Fran Knight allows X followers to become cavalry. If they are already cavalry, they will receive the ability to fly. Maintain. Cavalry Readiness will be maintained until the reset time of the next day. Banners like the sea, spears piercing through the forest, the knight is ready to go. Heaven's Armor Evernight VI Light 4, spell, pay XMP. The Fran Knight summons X number of holy swords from the sky to attack the enemy, dealing 5 points of damage. When the light of judgment plows through the battlefield, the undead army is reduced to ashes. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 694. Y-Town Vanguard, Holy Song, Group Charge, Encourage, Cavalry Readiness, and Heaven's Armor. 6 cards fell into Brando's hand and stacked together. Brando withdrew his hand, and all the cards turned into countless white mysterious runes and lines of law that merged into his chest. Seeing this, Tumen could not help but ask, "Isn't 6 cards too little for a single deck?" Brando smiled confidently, then shook his head. "Interesting, I think I understand what you're thinking." The Elemental Emperor from the era of the War of the Holy Saints pondered for a moment, then said, "You want to put the abilities of every profession in the world into your deck, combining them into one, and use the cards of fate to simulate completely different power systems. Good idea. But there are many kinds of professions in Wond. Can you use cards to simulate all of them?" Of course, Brando had already considered these questions and he replied confidently, "Wond has experienced thousands or even tens of thousands of years of history, and thousands of professions have evolved. Even different inheritances of different organizations can evolve into 2 completely different professions. For example, the Wind Elf Star Knight and Steel Scale are both inheritances of the Star Inheritance, but the skills they master are completely different." However, he changed the topic. "The root of the problem is that the power system on the continent of Vaunt can only be divided into 12. Among them, the professions that pursue the limits of battle skills and explore their own potential are divided into 2. Warriors, mercenaries, swordsmen, and even the noble knight can be classified into one of them. Archers and assassins, who pursue lightness and agility, are on the other side of the scale. There are also wizards who explore the mysteries of the law, such as law wizards, flux mages, and charm warlocks. Then there are the rulers of the elements, elementalists. You must be familiar with this profession, Emperor. Next, there are warlocks, witches, necromancers, and followers of chaos who control chaos and dark magic. They are the best of the best. Then there are those who control the balance of nature. Druids and tree herders are mortal enemies, but they are born from this. Then there are Alice and Helene, the beloved of the twin goddesses, those who interpret fate, and astrologers are the representatives of this. Tumen's eyes lit up when he heard Brando's explanation of the professions. It was the first time in 1,000 years that he had heard someone divide the power system of the continent in this way. And the more he listened, the more he felt that Brando's words made sense. Not only the Elemental Emperor, but even Saint All could not help but listen to him. Legend had it that an era ago, before Ababel Fortress had fallen, and the Grand Library was still well preserved with information from the era of the divine people. People had indeed divided the power of the world into several systems. But after the disaster, all knowledge and these precious documents were lost their whereabouts. Tumen listened carefully to Brendel's explanation and increasingly felt that this might be the truth. He could not help but narrow his eyes. He did not understand why this young man in front of him could see the essence of power so clearly. Of course, the Elemental Emperor perhaps. What Brando was talking about was actually the introduction to the Amber Sword's power on the official website. If there was anyone who was not clear about this introduction, it would probably be those who had never played the game. Brando continued, however, in addition to the power of nature and the law, as well as the magic of chaos, the law of Tiamat also promises the power of holiness to the world. The secular Hilmer divine system holds the power of creation. The priests of the Holy Cathedral of Fire and the priests of the Holy Cathedral of Wind worship this divine system, so they hold the power of healing. The arrogant Inca divine system controls the sword of destruction. Lightning and holy flames are their authority. The Knight of the Holy Cathedral believes in arbitration and judgment. After that is the power of the mind. The power of the mind is born in the spirit, language and sound. Bards and psionic warlocks are rare, but they are not legends. In addition, the magical technology that extends from the power of magic has brought alchemists and mechanics. There is also a more special power system. Brando suddenly said. Before Tumen could speak, the Wind Empress could not help but let out a curious sound. But then she seemed to feel a little embarrassed and could not help but snort coldly. Brando had been with this elf lady for a long time. How could he not understand what she was thinking? He quickly explained, this power system is special, not that it is weak. It should be said that it has existed before or it only exists in fantasy. What class? Saint Tassel finally could not help but say, damn you Brando, don't keep me guessing. That's because you are too anxious, Lady Wind Empress? Brando was about to say this, but the former glared at him. He could only reply helplessly, actually I don't know, I just heard about it. Heard about it? The Wind Empress stared at him suspiciously. Yes. Brando nodded, but he knew that it was not just hearsay. It was that he could not explain the existence of this class for the time being. The Interpreter of the Slate, a gift from the era of the gods. A class that players could never touch in this era, how could he explain it? The elf lady seemed to trust Brando. She looked at him silently and finally nodded. In other words, the power system of the entire Wand world is divided into these 12? In fact, it should be 11. Although swordsmen and archers look very different in the army, there is no difference in the nature of their power. Saint Tassel was very knowledgeable, and her words immediately made Tumen nod. Brando also nodded. You can say that. In short, although there are thousands of classes in the world of Wand. But in the end, it is only formed by the intertwining of these 12 power systems. For example, the Rangers of the Ring of Sky and the Ring of Raptors are actually just warriors who master archers and the path of nature at the same time. But time is fair to everyone. Most people who take care of multiple power systems are often not as far as those who pursue one path. Of course, there are a few of them who are outstanding. Brendel explained, and if I want to perfect my deck, all I need to do is to pick a few classes that I need, and those that are representative of them will be enough. For example, the Knight of Farron or the Silver Wizard of Buga. After listening, Tumen frowned and thought for a moment, then sighed, well said. Although there may be some omissions in the details, it is basically like that. Whether it is the gold or silver folk or the black iron folk, in fact they are just operating under these power systems. But even so, have you ever thought that there is another problem? He looked at Brando and became serious. Although your deck can include all the power systems and turn them into one, have you ever considered that because of the restrictions of the law of existence on switching decks, in fact, you can only use one or two of them at any time? And the power of a planeswalker is of a higher level than these power systems. Don't you think it is too wasteful to waste it on simulating these low-end power systems? Secondly, because most of your cards are spells, it is easy to be countered. And this is one of the biggest taboos that planeswalkers pursue. Tumen was worthy of being a long-established and experienced planeswalker. With just a little thought, he saw the fatal weakness of Brando's deck, at least in his opinion. Because for any planeswalker, their lifelong pursuit was a perfect cycle of cards. So the more restrained the deck was, the less significance it had in their eyes. The ultimate system was the first lesson that a planeswalker apprentice had to learn. But after hearing Tumen's words, Brando gently shook his head. No, Lord Tumen, I don't think so. Planeswalkers pursue the ultimate and perfection, But in thousands of years, has anyone succeeded? This. Tumen was stunned. He could not help but look up at the gloomy sky of the Greyhill Mountains. The history under the sky had been repeated for thousands of years. But history was like a cycle, and no one had ever broken through the final result. Had a planeswalker ever succeeded? Of course not, otherwise why would they spend their lives searching? Brando smiled. I have experienced a battle before. He remembered the battle with Williams, and that last thrilling moment would forever be engraved in his heart. He replied, the experience of this battle made me understand that no matter how perfect the cycle is, it is impossible to face all situations. So, I think that perfection is only a relative state, he said with assurance. How to achieve a more perfect state in a battle compared to the enemy? Actually, we are all wrong because the answer is very simple. We just need to become stronger than him. In order to achieve this goal, all power can be borrowed. As long as the advantage is focused on one moment, all tricks will vanish. Tumen looked at Brando. This elemental emperor from the era of the War of the Holy Saints took a deep breath. I know a few old friends who have the same idea as you. They pursue extreme violence. As long as the enemy is destroyed, everything is meaningless. But they failed. Do you know why? Because there is always a taller mountain, and there will always be someone stronger than him. The so-called concept of being the strongest is just an ideal. Brando blurted out without thinking. You know? Tumen was slightly startled and looked at the young man curiously. Yes. Brando smiled, but I am different from them. Because I also know that one person can never be stronger than a team. He enunciated each and every word clearly. A single person can never be stronger than a team. After a certain period of time, this sentence was repeatedly mentioned in his memory. That distinct and amiable face, with its hands on its waist and its long black hair draped over its shoulders, also spoke to them word by word. Always remember, one person can never be stronger than a team. This is a game of division of labor and cooperation. I do not welcome individual heroism. Especially you, Sophie. Thinking of this, Brando could not help but smile slightly. But in front of him, Tumen was already deeply frowning. He suddenly thought of something and raised his head in shock. Wait, that guy Kelsey? Are you thinking of doing this? Brando looked at the Elemental Emperor's expression and knew that he had completely understood. He nodded and replied, Yes, Emperor. In fact, before this trip I had already decided. When I received Sir Kelsey's inheritance, the most precious inheritance I received was not his cards, but his knowledge. Tumen let out a long breath. Planeswalkers each had their own characteristics. But when it came to Kelsey's specialty, it was not his black and white, the endless paradise of adversity. It was the theory he created in the last moments of his life. Planeswalker creatures. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 695. The deer-bodied demoness Helene and the pendulum golem. In fact, their appearance had piqued Brando's curiosity. After the battle in the underground tomb, he finally found out that the summoned creatures of cards could also use cards. Helene had said that she and the pendulum golem had only used Kelsey's cards in a simulated environment. But at least this proved that the great planeswalker must have had similar ideas when he was alive. And this was indeed the case. Kelsey had left behind some records. In his later years he had this idea to establish a new law on the creature cards. If a planeswalker could summon all creatures, why couldn't a planeswalker summon other planeswalkers? This was undoubtedly a bold idea that bordered on genius. It was not an exaggeration to say that this idea was bold and imaginative. And the craziest thing was that Kelsey had succeeded. Or rather, he had succeeded in some sense. He first reassembled the deer-bodied demoness and the pendulum golem, two of the strongest cards he had, and the ones he had the deepest feelings for. It could be said that Helene and the pendulum golem were his first experimental subjects. This experimental subject was not perfect, but it gave Kelsey a direction. But it was a pity that this great genius, or rather madman, could not complete his idea. Before he could create a perfect summoned creature, an unknown danger from the underground of Tanajul erupted. He and the Witch Empress chose to use their lives to seal the entire tomb. They also sealed his life's work within it. And this record was eventually passed to Brando by the deer-bodied demoness. In fact, what Brando obtained was not the complete idea, because even Kelsey did not have the time to perfect it. What was left to him was only a record full of flaws. But this was enough. Just like Brando's idea, it did not need to be perfect, but as long as it could be used to its fullest potential. With the experience of his previous life, It was not impossible for him to create the strongest deck of cards that belonged only to him. You want to summon a planeswalker creature? Tumen looked at him and asked nervously. Brando nodded. Tumen immediately put on a serious expression and asked, but do you know that Kelsey's method is not perfect? After all, a planeswalker has a special authority. He is above all the power systems you mentioned. His method of summoning a planeswalker creature is actually a compromise. I know, Brando replied. Master Kelsey actually shared his authority as a planeswalker so that his summoned creatures would have the same power as his own. There are two problems. First, the sharing of the authority will reduce the limit of the planeswalker's card deck. Second, the summoned creatures will have the same authority as the planeswalker, so they can turn against the planeswalker at any time. Brendel was actually a person who was keen on seeking victory in the midst of danger. He was completely different from those who were cautious and meticulous in their actions. That was why Senpai paid the most attention to him when he was in the Amber Sword. It's the result of a person's idea. He's. The most important thing is to know your enemy as well as yourself. Therefore he didn't need Tumen to say anything. He had already investigated all the consequences. Apart from that, he continued, the authority of a planeswalker can't be shared infinitely. With Kelsey's, he can only share 4 additional authorities. With Mai's I can only have 2 at most. So you understand that. Tumen fell silent. Brando's card deck's capacity was a problem that all planeswalkers had to face. Unlike apprentices who could use other people's card decks without any scruples, every card in a planeswalker's hand was the embodiment of his own law and the construction of the world. Therefore he had to reserve a certain amount of power for each card to maintain. This relationship was generally proportional to the size of the elemental pool. It was usually 10-1, but there was no lack of smaller or larger pools. Tumen thought for a moment and said, Kelsey is almost at the peak of planeswalkers. His power can be said to be on par with mine. Above that would be Lord Odin's level. Since ancient times, there have only been 2 or 3 people at that level. That is to say, even if you consider going down this path, you can only have 4 or 5 planeswalker creatures at most. Also, you have to consider carefully. These planeswalker creatures themselves have a lot of drawbacks. I've thought about it, Lord Tumen. Although I still thank you for your reminder, Brando smiled, I think this is my best choice. The Elemental Emperor couldn't help but shake his head. He couldn't help but glance at the Saint-Tassol who had been watching the show coldly and said, this is also your precious student. Aren't you going to persuade him? The Wind Empress spread her hands, this is your planeswalker's business. Besides, I believe in this little guy. Nothing he has done so far has been wrong. Can you believe this? This in itself is a miracle. Tumen was slightly stunned and couldn't help but fall silent for a moment. Then he raised his head and asked, you've thought it through? Then what do you plan to do? Leave it to me, Brando was confident. He had been thinking about this moment since he left the catacombs. After going through the Battle of Ampere Seal, he saw his own thoughts clearly. Moreover, he was hiding a secret that he couldn't tell anyone. He only hoped to verify his conjecture. If it was true, then his path as a planeswalker in the future would be unimaginable. I want to first confirm the core card of the Night deck. First, I need to reshape my elemental pool and card library. Tumen nodded. Very good. Unknown laws are dangerous for anyone. It's a good thing to do things steadily. Then I'll watch from here. You can start. Brando nodded and then drew a card from the air. The pattern on the card was so familiar. Under the curtain of stars, a female knight holding a spear and her unicorn were walking through the forest together. This quiet scene seemed to tell a story from 1,000 years ago to the present day. The Medisha in the picture was the same as when they first met in the Eternal Song Forest. Medisha, have you thought it through? Brando asked. This may not be a good thing for you. It may take away your eternal life. The girl's voice smiled slightly as if it came from the void. My lord, Medisha has already said that it is my honor to be able to follow my lord. Besides, my lord, have you forgotten that Medisha's eternal life is built on your cards? Brando understood. He was slightly moved. Most planeswalkers would more or less consider the backlash of summoning creatures when they gave away their authority. But he was sure that Medisha would never do anything to harm him. He stretched out his hand and pointed at the card. According to the method recorded by Kelsey, he extended his law onto the card. Tumen and Saint-Tassol who were present saw that at that moment, the dazzling silver line of law extended from Brando's body and then wrapped around the Unicorn Knight's card. The silver line of law was even more stable than Brando's spatial law. It vibrated slightly in the stone circle. For a moment, the entire spatial law seemed to resonate with it as if bowing down to this supreme law. However, after a moment, a dark golden card slid out from the wrapping of the line of law and fell into Brando's hand. Fran Knight Eternal Song I Light 30, Creature. Fran Knight, Silver Elf, Level 1. When the Fran Knight enters the field, it has 60 MP ability, Planeswalker. Tap, restores 10 MP Maintain. The Fran Knight is a permanent object on the field. Her loyalty is like the straightest sword. She would rather be broken than bent. Planeswalker ability. A summoned creature with the Planeswalker ability can use the cards of fate from its summoner's elemental pool like a real Planeswalker. It can gain experience and use equipment like normal. But once a summoned creature with the Planeswalker ability runs out of MP or life, it will be completely destroyed. Time seemed to flow quietly for a few seconds. Tumen, Brando, and Saint Tassol just looked at the dark golden card. After a long while, the Elemental Emperor from the era of the War of the Holy Saints could not help but sigh. Although I don't support you doing this, I have to admit that Kelsey is really a genius. In the world of exploring the power of law, I am far inferior to him. This card has already rewritten the history of Planeswalkers. Tumen's eyes revealed an expression as if he was looking at a piece of art. He even looked a little obsessed. But after a while, Tumen could not help but shake his head. But this kind of law may not be the best for you, Brando. Do you understand? Because you may have to work 1,000 times harder than others. You and I have both forgotten one thing. He continued to add, although they are Planeswalker creatures, the land cards and elemental pools they use are still your own. If you have 4 Planeswalker creatures, then the ratio of land cards in your deck will probably drag down the combat power of your entire deck. The Elemental Emperor raised his head as if wanting to comfort Brando, but he immediately found that the young man he had always admired was just standing there in a daze. Brando? It was not just Tumen. Even Saint Tassol at the side noticed the abnormality. They saw that a bright flame seemed to light up in Brando's eyes, and a strange smile appeared on his face. Soon, the latter raised his head a little stiffly like a puppet. He glanced at Saint Tassol, then at Tumen, and then said dryly, "You guys better look at this thing." "What?" "My elemental pool." Brando faced Tumen and the Wind Empress and suddenly closed his eyes. His left hand and right hand overlapped, and the power of magic and elemental immediately began to gather in his magic triangle area. In just a moment, the Elemental Emperor's eyes widened. This is impossible. Won's history was long and complicated. In the long river of history, there were very few people who could be called Elemental Emperors. Tumen was one of the best. His talent as an elementalist was unprecedented. Later folklore said that when he opened his elemental pool, the astrologers at that time announced the birth of a future Elemental Emperor. This was because Tumen was probably the only one in Wond who had just opened his elemental pool and the capacity of all elements reached 100 slots. However, even Tumen himself had never seen or heard of such a possibility. He had never even considered the possibility of such a thing happening. 2 elemental pools. Brando had 2 elemental pools. At that moment, Tumen and Saint Tassol almost thought that there was something wrong with their eyes. They made an action that was extremely unbefitting of their status at the same time, and subconsciously rubbed their eyes. However, they immediately noticed that the other party was doing the same thing and realized that there was a problem. This was actually true. There was actually someone who had 2 elemental pools at the same time. Tumen looked at Brando, and finally could not maintain his usual calm and composure. He could not help but grab Brando's shoulder. Of course, his subconscious action only allowed his hand to pass through Brando's body like a shadow. This Elemental Emperor from the era of the War of the Holy Saints grabbed empty air, and then remembered that he was just an image. But this did not calm his shock. He could not help but ask in astonishment, "Brando, what is going on?" Brando looked at the 2 people in front of him with some surprise. Of course he knew what was going on. Finally, after a long wait, after officially crossing that invisible barrier and officially becoming a planeswalker, he, as the other half of Sophie's soul, finally had his own elemental pool. And it was far more than just this time. He found that his 2 souls had the same authority in the power system of planeswalkers. What did this mean? Brando almost laughed wildly in his heart. As expected, he had guessed correctly. He could separate 2 times more authority than a normal person. P.S. Today's 3 chapters involve a lot of settings. I spent a lot of time describing them to make the settings seem reasonable. That's why I dragged it out so late, equals. I feel that even writing 30,000 words a day is not so tiring. It's too mentally exhausting. I'm really tired. I hope everyone can support me more. In addition, this is the 9th day. I'll update 10,000 times a day. I'll update another day tomorrow. I've almost made up for the debt from last month, so I may start another chapter tomorrow. Everyone please support me. Go to hell, the strong baboon. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Jianghu to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 696. What did double the authority mean? It meant that at his peak he could even summon 8 or more planeswalker creatures to fight for him. Each of these planeswalker creatures was like him. They could level up, equip powerful magic items, and even use cards of fate. Therefore, one could imagine, with the support of the double elemental pool, after each round of card grabs, how spectacular would it be if 9 planeswalkers at their peak attacked at the same time. In the face of such a huge advantage, the flaws in the eyes of ordinary planeswalkers, and the flaws that Tumen was worried about, were long gone. Thinking of this, Brando couldn't help but tremble a little as he closed his eyes. If it was said that he was a little hesitant before he officially chose this path, but at this moment, after truly confirming his thoughts, he finally understood that a planeswalker's path that belonged only to him had been engraved in the history of this world. This was the true path to perfection and the limit. It was unique and could not be replicated. In the eyes of others, it was as difficult as ascending to the heavens, but in Brando's eyes, it was so fitting for him. Double elemental pool, double authority, and even this set of cards to him only needed to consider a large amount of equipment, experience, and the capacity of the elemental pool. As a veteran warrior who had been reborn, Brando happened to be the part that he was best at. Because Brando could be sure that in this world, except for the gods and the pale poem that recorded everything, there was probably no one who knew more secrets than him. Whether it was the past, the future, or the present. But all of this to Brando was not some kind of luck or coincidence, because no one knew him better than himself. Before he embarked on this path, even the moment when Brando received Kelsey's manuscript, he knew that this was the path that was most suitable for him. And now, every single detail confirmed his thoughts. After he closed his eyes for a moment, he opened them again. The mountains reflected in his eyes, and at that moment, the undulating mountain range gave him some kind of illusion, as if the whole world was under his feet. This was the power that belonged only to planeswalkers, using everything as a blade and the world as a battlefield. Brando let out a long breath as if to express this feeling from his heart. He slowly let go of his hands, and the power of the elements also collapsed in his palms. At that moment, Tumen and Saint Tassol looked at this scene with some regret. The 2 elemental emperors and the king of sages from the era of the War of the Holy Saints seemed to be in a trance, as if a miracle was disappearing from their vision and no longer. It was indeed a miracle. But compared to Tumen and Saint Tassol's judgment, the way Brando saw the miracle was more direct. The 2 elemental pools on his left and right were like 2 trembling light in the air, clearly showing him the complete data: frowny face fire, 2020, wind, 2020 earth, 2020, water, 2020, light, 4040, dark, 10, nature, fire 6060, wind, 6060, 6060, 60, 6060, dark, 1N, nature, 6060. There were 2 elemental pools, one big and one small. The smaller one obviously belonged to Brando's soul. After all the elements were initialized, the natural elemental pool was still 0. This could only mean that Brando himself was not fated with the druid's power system. However, after being bestowed by Martha, his affinity with the light element was still far ahead, even more than double that of the other elements. And the other one was even more outrageous. As an initial elemental pool, the capacity of all attributes was as high as 60. The dark elemental pool was so high that it was impossible to look at it directly. Although this capacity was far less than that of the elemental emperor Tumen back then, it was still an unimaginable number compared to those who had a certain amount of elementalist talent, or those who were recommended to study at St. Tassol's Talim Elemental Academy or Atlanta's Howling Hall. In fact, Brando himself could not believe that half of Sophie's soul would have such a strong elemental affinity. "Look at your deck," Tumen suddenly shouted. Brando actually realized the same problem. He opened the panel, and 2 sets of numbers immediately dazzled his eyes. 6, 10, 13, 20, 2 elemental pools meant that there were 2 separate card pools. Although he had expected this, Brando still felt a little suffocated when he saw this scene. He silently looked at the panel, then looked up at Tumen. Although he did not speak, the meaning in his eyes was self-evident. 2 decks. Tumen sucked in a breath of cold air. He was about to lose his mind. Brando nodded. In the name of Martha. It seemed like a short while or a long time had passed, For a moment, the strange scene on the platform made it difficult for the three of them to realize the passage of time. The roaring mountain wind between the mountains seemed to be an annotation of this moment. After what seemed like a century, Saint Tassol seemed to have finally recovered from the previous shock. Brando, Odin really has good taste. What is going on? But before Brando could answer this question, Tumen interrupted them. The young man stared at Brando with his blood-red eyes and asked, "Brando, did you expect this?" Brando was slightly startled. He did not expect the Elemental Emperor to be so sharp as to notice this. He hesitated. This was one of his biggest secrets. If he could, he would rather keep it a secret. But in the next moment he changed his mind and nodded slightly. "Yes, but I don't know how to explain it, Lord Tumen." "Then there's no need to explain," Tumen replied solemnly. He looked at Brando seriously and sighed. "Perhaps one day you will become a legend among planeswalkers, Brando." Brendel sucked in a breath of air. The reason why he said this was to not lose the other party's trust. After all, his planeswalker legacy was inherited from this elemental emperor. Moreover, the other party's heroic soul might have already become one of the stars in the sky above Wond. He did not have to worry about the other party seeing through anything. And Tumen did not disappoint him. The elemental emperor paused for a moment and continued to ask, "So, you have now determined your path. How are you going to choose the cards in your hand?" Brando knew that this was the main event. The card library's capacity was 4, 10, and 12, 20. The former represented the maximum limit of his card library. The latter represented the number of cards he could temporarily possess and did not need to add to his card library. After entering the domain of official planeswalkers, because of the clear boundaries of the laws, planeswalkers could no longer walk around with cards that belonged to others as they could when they were apprentices. After all, cards that came from different laws would inevitably conflict with the planeswalker's own laws. Once this conflict exceeded a certain limit, there would be a serious backlash. The consequences of the backlash would be the destruction of the cards. In the worst case, the planeswalker would be implicated and even completely destroy the planeswalker's own laws. This kind of incident had happened before in history. The moment Brando officially advanced into a planeswalker, his mind seemed to automatically have memories of this knowledge. However, he had already considered these problems and replied without hesitation, "I've already thought about it. But before that, I plan to instantiate the second authority." "The second authority?" Tumen raised his head and looked at Brando's cards and asked, "This time, which one of the 12 power systems are you going to choose?" "This time I plan to appoint people by favoritism." Brando smiled and raised his head. His gaze swept to another card in the air and asked, "The Shire, are you ready?" "I'm ready to level up at any time, my lord." The Shire's voice was full of confidence in him as usual. "I'm afraid you won't level up, but you'll have to go back to zero first. From now on, you can't die and come back to life, live and die again. Have you thought about it?" Brando became serious. "Don't say it like dying and coming back to life. Living and dying seems to be a very happy thing, my lord." The Shire's voice could not help but complain. Besides, to be able to leave the category of cards and be more like a normal person, this is already a great favor for this humble one. "Then I understand." Brando nodded. "This time is the opposite of the last time. I'll start with you as the core to instantiate this set of cards." As he spoke, he stretched out his hand and pointed it forward. "I rule this law will be born from this." The white holy tower flashed in the clouds, and the mage holding the long scroll walked on the holy ladder. The voice echoed on the platform. The holy tree mysteriously fell into his hand as if the clouds were gathering in the air. It fell between the clouds. Immediately, white spires rose. The spires shone brightly under the sun. Then, the white streets, corridors and bridges seemed to materialize from the colorful light. Mages with long scrolls in their hands walked out of the spires, and in the blink of an eye, they used mysterious magic to create a glorious city. In the center of the city, a giant tree rose from the ground. The branches as white as ivory supported the emerald tree crown and shrouded the entire city. Under the city that floated above the clouds, the blue sea formed the background of the entire world. Brando then put in the ember volcano, and the shadow of the mountain suddenly emitted thick smoke at the end of the sky. The two land cards merged into this new world, and the chaotic world immediately stabilized. Only then did Brendel have the time to look at the blue world of the sea and the great plains next to it. Both worlds were suspended in the void like two small sandboxes. Then he said, "This is your world, the Shire." "Thank you, my lord." The Shire's voice laughed. Brando pointed and replied, "I named Medish's world Faerun, which means the glory of the plains. And your world is called Bianca. This blue sea is the source of your power. It is the symbol of the silver mages, noble, mysterious, elegant, and ever-changing. Silver mages have stood at the peak of the law for thousands of years. Their power comes from the wisdom and the exploration of knowledge that they are proud of. He reached out his hand and the Shire's card was already in his palm. Silver flames seemed to be burning on the card. After the flames burned, the dark gold color of the card was revealed. Silver-robed mage law I waiter 30, creature. Silver-robed mage human, level 1. When the silver-robed mage enters the field, he has 100 mana. Ability, Planeswalker. Tap restores 20 mana. Maintain, the silver-robed mage is a permanent object on the field. The words flowing between the scrolls are the key to opening the door of power. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 697. Magic Refraction Law I Water 3, Spells, pay X mana, Wizard, target the target spell and make it choose X new targets. After this card is used, shuffle it into the deck. I am in charge of your magic, Obelisk Guard Audio. Ether Dragon Law I Water 25, Creature, Elemental Creature Pseudo-Dragon, level 35. Pay X mana, Wizard, X must be an integer of 10, place X Ether Dragons into the field. Pay 3 water, move the Ether Dragons out of the battle. Each Ether Dragon has 3 counters, remove 1 counter every 10 minutes, and restore a point of mana for all allies. When all counters are removed, place the Ether Dragons back into the field. Maintain, the Ether Dragons will be maintained until the time of reset. Energy is always switching forms at every moment. Mirror Image Law IV Water 20, Spells, pay 10 X MP Wizard, and choose X Blue, Water, or Cyan Wind, creatures. If you do this, Mirror Image will duplicate the same number of creatures. Maintain, Mirror Image will last for an hour. You are me, I am you. Brendel looked up at the cards in the sky. Energy Loss, Wind Spirit Spiders, and Rune Summoner turned into Mana Refraction, Ether Dragon, and Mirror Image respectively and fell into his hands. Just like what had happened before, all the cards were automatically upgraded to silver level. Putting away these cards, Brando only had 3 empty slots in his deck, barely enough for him to build another deck. He looked at the cards floating in the air and had a plan in mind. A complete team in addition to a knight and a wizard, naturally needed a healer. Although there was Maria in the territory, the fiancée of Karglais was too weak, and as for the other priests of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, he might not be able to trust them. Therefore, using the cards of fates to build a priest profession was, in fact, an urgent matter for Brando. He drew a card from the air. Originally, the most suitable Planeswalker card for a priest deck was undoubtedly the Pristine Archangel, but considering that it was a permanent calling card in the field, it was a bit too ostentatious to parade around with a winged birdman. After some thought, Brando chose the Radiant Trumpeter from Pure Heaven. He wasn't familiar with that set of cards. He hesitated for a moment before asking, "What is your name?" "My name is Hipamera, Master Planeswalker." A gentle girl's voice replied. "All right, Hipamera, are you willing to give up your immortal body and become a Planeswalker?" Brando asked. The voice in the card paused for a moment before asking in delight, "Can I?" "As long as you're willing." "Of course I'm willing, Sir Planeswalker," Hipamera replied without hesitation. "Very well, accept my law." Brando gently took off the card and pointed at a land card. "I will use the name of Sacred Mountain Paragon to establish a holy kingdom. It will be the birthplace of faith, the source of the sacred flame." The mountains of Anjou then fell to the ground, and a grayish-white wilderness and plateau rose between Belinka and Farlan. Although it was uninhabited, the scenery above the sacred white plateau was magnificent, as if it was filled with a sacred aura. Then the Radiant Trumpeter card slipped from the silver cocoon of the Threads of Law and fell into his palm. Brando looked down and saw that the face of the Radiant Trumpeter card had indeed turned into a quaint dark gold, and the name had also changed to Priestess Himelud. Priestess Himelud was a famous priest-like profession in Atlanta. It was the opposite of the aggressive scepter priests of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. The priestesses who believed in the eldest daughter of the earth goddess Gaia and the tundra goddess Himelud were good at defense. They lived an ascetic life under the sacred mountain, so much so that they were called the shepherdesses of Himelud. And this card was described as follows: Priestess Himelud Belief I Earth 30 Creature. Priestess Himelud Human Level 1. When Priestess Himelud entered the field, she had 100 mana. Ability Planeswalker. Tap recover 20 mana. Maintain Priestess Himelud is on the field as a permanent. Persevere in your beliefs, never wavering like a rock, and you will be blessed by the spirit of the mountains, braid Silverfire. Then Brando read, Spirit of the mountains, bless your people. A card fell from the air, and on the card was Enroldo's holy ring. But the silver fire ignited from the card, and in the blink of an eye, it turned into the Song of Blessing. The Song of Blessing was a signature skill that Priestess Himalud learned when she reached level 40 and met the conditions for her first profession change. Simply put, it was group invincibility. This skill essentially changed Priestess Himalud's weak position, and it was from this skill that Priestess Himalud became a legendary priestess. And now, the card in front of Brando was described as follows. Song of Blessing Belief II Light 10, Earth 10, Spell, pay 25x mana and choose X targets to nullify the next attack on them. Maintain the effect of the Song of Blessing lasts for 10 minutes. The ethereal hymn breaks the long sword, the mountains of Anru, Priestess Himalud, and the Song of Blessing fell into Brando's hands in turn, automatically stacking into a stack. Then white flames ignited, turning into countless mysterious runes that merged into Brando's body. Brando closed his eyes slightly, and the third deck of cards was also formed. And at this moment he had chosen all 19 cards of fate in the two decks. But there were still a large number of cards floating in the air, and Brando had to choose 30 of them to keep, and the rest could only be left to dissipate into the void. Of course, it was impossible not to feel heartache about this kind of thing, but he had no choice. He turned his head, and both Tumen and Saint Tassol stared at him. Although the Wind Empress didn't seem to understand what all this meant, she could see that Brando was about to make a difficult choice. The two nodded at him in unison. Brando let out a soft sigh of relief. In fact, he already had a plan in mind. First of all, he naturally wouldn't give up on those cards that he had deep feelings for. Although it sounded a little strange, but just like Kelsey, the Deer Demoness, and the Pendulum Golem, that great planeswalker would definitely not give up on these two assistants that had been with him for many years. Even if they were just cards. Brando raised his head, and first chose the Fireclaw Lizardman Lord, Fireclaw Lizardman, Fireclaw Trumpeter, Bloodthrone Vampire Mephistopheles, Night Lord Andrique, and the always unlucky Fire Giant and Pristine Archangel. These cards had been with him for a certain period of time, and in comparison he would rather waste a slot for them than choose the more powerful cards. Because although Brando pursued power, it didn't mean that he was going to be a cold and heartless person. Then there were the resource cards, Water of the Dark Realm, Forest of Death, Rich Gold Mine, Sea Wave Gem, Silver Swallowtail Flag, Tax Officer of Grey Harbor, Draws Wilderness and Ruggin Swamp. Because he didn't have many resource cards to begin with, and now that he had to support the huge consumption of several planeswalkers, these cards naturally couldn't be easily given up. Finally, there were the powerful cards such as the Grimoire of Life, Impasse Trojan Horse, 2 Accelerated Thinking, 2 Anxiety Disorder, and Lightning Storm. Then there were Daybreak, Echelon's Furnace of Adversity, Echelon Spellweaver, 2 High Spirits, Radiant Martyr, and Graveyard Rebirth. Finally, he also used the card wealth that he had accumulated over the past few days to unlock the Platinum Angel that had been with him for a long time. Just like that, all 30 cards were chosen. After Brando put all these cards into his backup deck, he raised his head and watched the void around him gradually dissipate, as if a vortex was sucking in the cards that weren't chosen. To be honest, he felt that it was a pity, but it didn't help. Brando silently stared at the vortex for a moment, then with the magnanimity of a player, he threw the card book in his hand forward. The card book was instantly torn into countless pieces in the storm of energy, and then completely sucked into the center of the vortex with the scattered cards. It was as if in just a moment, it disappeared without a trace. In the next moment, even the vortex itself rapidly shrank into a black dot, and then disappeared. This is a step that young planeswalkers have to go through. You have to give up something to gain something. Tumen stood behind Brando watching him finish all this and comforted him, but congratulations on joining us and becoming a real planeswalker. Brando raised his head, and his heart also felt relieved. He couldn't help but take a deep breath. Since leaving Bragg's underground auction after experiencing so many things, he had finally come to this step today. From being ignorant of planeswalkers to officially becoming one of them today. Looking back, he felt as if a lifetime had passed. Thank you, Lord Tumen. He stared at the distant mountains and replied softly. No need to thank me. Passing down the legacy of planeswalkers from generation to generation is a sacred duty. Including me, including you, we all have to fulfill this duty. Tumen replied seriously, although you have come to this step today as your guide, I am very gratified. But in fact, until now, I am still very worried about you. You should understand that your deck still has a flaw. Even if you have dual elemental pools, you can't support the consumption of so many planeswalker creatures. Tumen reminded him seriously, I hope you can consider this problem carefully. Brando looked at the elemental emperor who guided him into the world of planeswalkers and smiled slightly. I have already thought about it, Emperor. Have you thought about it? Brando nodded. Tumen was startled but then fell silent. With his experience and knowledge, he naturally sensed that Brando was not lying. Since he said that he had the ability to solve this problem, it meant that he must have the confidence to do so. This elemental emperor from the era of the War of the Holy Saints thought for a moment and replied, Well then, since you have met my requirements, then I have come this time to give you a gift. A gift? Brando was startled. But before he could react, Tumen had already stretched out a finger and flicked a ball of light into his forehead. He widened his eyes slightly, as if pages of continuous movie-like images appeared in his mind. Finally, these images froze on a page. It was an old page with undulating lines and various diagrams drawn on it. Brando observed for a moment before realizing that it was a map. He could not help but frown and ask, A map? Where is this map of? You will naturally understand in the future. Tumen smiled slightly and did not answer, but I can tell you that this is a treasure map. As for what the treasure is, you will have to explore it yourself. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 698. Without waiting for Brando to continue asking, she suddenly waved her hand and said, All right, I've done what I came here to do. Brando, I'm glad to see you officially join us as one of us. After this farewell, I'm afraid it will be difficult to see you again in the future. You can only rely on yourself for the future. Brando was stunned. It wasn't that he didn't know that the Elemental Emperor would eventually leave, but it was only when the Elemental Emperor said goodbye that he realized that he was facing a legend from thousands of years ago. Lord Tumen, hey, don't be shy. We're all men. Besides, with Saint Tassol teaching you, I believe you won't have too many problems. Tumen smiled slightly. Although he's a little stubborn, he's one of my best students. Umph. The Wind Empress snorted heavily. But when she looked up at the translucent Tumen, she could not help but frown. Old man, I have a question too. Tumen turned his head and asked with a smile, Ask away, my student. After the Battle of Osopeo, did you die? Saint Tassol hesitated for a moment before asking. There seemed to be a moment of silence on the platform. But Tumen finally spread out his hands. I'm afraid it's difficult for me to answer this question. Because you know the history after the Battle of Osopeo better than I do. When I left this image, the late king should still be in Elka. That was before we marched into the Great Swamp. Saint Tassol frowned and looked at him. Brando muttered to himself, but in his mind, he was recalling the history of the conversation between the two. In the War of the Holy Saints, the four sages did not have an army to resist the Dark Dragon from the beginning. In fact, before marching into the Great Swamp, the Dark Dragon did not care about these lowly people from other races. Before the Battle of Osopeo, this tyrant and dictator of history had been staying in Elka near the Eternal Glacier. Even the players did not understand this part of history. For example, there was no record of what he was planning in the Eternal Frozen Glacier. Brando could only guess that Kelsey's whereabouts might be related to this matter based on what the dear Demonis had said about Odin once inviting Kelsey to join him in fighting against the mysterious enemy. Soon after, the Battle of Osopel broke out, and the Resistance army invaded Demia. The victory of this battle became a turning point in history. Since then, the Resistance forces began to grow stronger. The Bugas and the Dragons joined the war one after another. Not long after that, news of the Elemental Emperor Tumen's death spread. When he thought of this, he could not help but glance at Tumen. The Bugas said they killed you, but some of the Silver Elves saw that you were only injured and fled, and not long after that you disappeared in the alfalfa fields. Saint Tassol continued, In the end, we weren't able to confirm whether or not you were really dead. However, to boost morale, Fanzan announced that you were dead. After listening to Saint Tassol's words, Tumen could not help but laugh. My student, does it really matter whether I'm dead or not? Besides, if you use the news of my death to boost morale with my temper, I would never hide and not show up. You know very well what I would do, so don't you already have an answer? By the time the Elemental Emperor finished speaking, the lower half of his body had almost disappeared. He looked like a ghost floating in the air. The elven sister looked at him like this and could not help but clench her fists, replying silently, I just wanted to confirm. You have confirmed it, Tumen replied, his voice gradually fading. Remember to say hello to Alanta for me. She will definitely cut your greeting in half. Saint Tassol watched Tumen's figure completely disappear, and after a long while, such a vicious sentence popped out of her mouth. Then she turned her head and looked at Brando, who was staring at her with his mouth agape, and could not help but vent her anger. "What are you looking at?" Brando hurriedly shrugged his shoulders. The grudges and disputes of the era of the War of the Holy Saints really had nothing to do with him, but presumably Tumen, as the teacher of Saint Tassol, Gretel, and Fanzan, must have had a hard time when these three sages fought with him. But when did the collapse of the Myrna people begin? Brando certainly knew of that era. The Myrna people at that time were as proud as the people of Cruz today. No, they were even more proud because the territory of their empire was once so vast that it included the entire Won today. Today's Cruz, Fanzan, Saint Tassol, and Atlanta were only a small part of the empire in that era. But even such a powerful empire eventually collapsed in an instant. And today the existence of the Myrna people could no longer be seen on the continent. Brando silently thought about these things, but he did not expect the Wind Empress to suddenly pat him and ask, "Speaking of which, what are you doing here?" The elf lady looked around suspiciously. "This place should be at the edge of the Black Forest. What are you doing in the wilderness alone? Is it just to see this old man?" Old man. She probably realized that the other party was dead, so her words seemed to be a little contradictory, so she changed her words halfway. "Of course not." Brando shook his head. Only then did he remember his purpose of coming here. But this matter was not easy to explain, so he could only answer ambiguously, "Of course I'm here to look for treasure. I met Lord Tumen, you saw it was just an accident." "Treasure hunt?" Saint Tassol stared at him suspiciously. "What treasure hunt? Let me see." As a former hero who had experienced the War of the Holy Saints, she instinctively smelled that Brando's words were not true. But unfortunately, although the Wind Empress was experienced and knowledgeable, she could not stump Brando. Brando took a few steps back as if he was silently counting his steps. He counted a few steps and then walked towards the mountain wall. Saint Tassol subconsciously thought that this guy was pretending to be mysterious. She narrowed her eyes, but she did not expect that in just a short moment, Brando pulled out something from the vines coiled around the mountain wall. "What is this?" The elf lady could not help but look at the thing in Brando's hand, and then she found that it was something like a slate. Brando just smiled mysteriously at the Wind Empress' question. "Of course this is something good." He kept her in suspense and answered. But this time he was not lying, because in another history, this slate was indeed something that changed Erwin's history. And this was the real reason why he asked Freya to come along. In another history this was the private property of the Valkyrie. And in this history, Brando naturally wanted to return it to its rightful owner. Tick-tock, tick-tock. In the large room, there seemed to be only the dull sound of a taut clock. This sound echoed in the empty room as if it was infinitely magnified. The shadow of the sun passed through the shade of the trees and fell in this study, leaving layers of shadows on the carpet, like a strange picture. A pair of snow-white feet wearing wooden clogs stepped on the carpet, occasionally ruining the artistic conception of the whole painting. Although Yura could not see, she seemed to have a natural ability to feel everything around her. She quietly walked around the room, occasionally turning back to look at her husband with a mysterious smile on her face. Those who were familiar with her knew that this future lord's wife had a special ability called foresight. Outsiders did not know how terrifying this lady overlord's ability was. But ever since she lived in this castle for 2 months, no one dared to look down on her authority. The young man sitting behind the desk, or the future lord of this territory, the night madman in Brando's eyes of course, was actually Eek. He held his chin with one hand and stared at his wife with a bored expression. In fact, ever since the Battle of Ampere Seal, the whole world seemed to have calmed down, and he began to feel out of place. The kind of life he was pursuing should be one where his blood boiled, and he would help the weak. But it was a pity that Erwin, or at least Erwin's southern border, was uncontrollably calming down with each passing day. The only news that was slightly exciting was that there was a war in the south that made Count Randner nervous day by day. Unfortunately, as long as Count Randner's brain was still functioning, he would probably not send an army into Anthony's territory. Moreover, after the Battle of Ampere Seal, Duke Anthony had strictly forbidden him from leaving. The young man could not help but sigh deeply and mumble, "My dear, you said that something would happen today, but we waited until now. It seems that your prophecy is wrong again." Yura was not annoyed by her husband's words. She turned to look at Eek and gave him a reassuring smile. Because she was wearing the traditional clothing of the nine-headed phoenix, her entire person was filled with a kind of elegant and intellectual beauty. Eek could not help but stare at her in a daze. He coughed lightly and asked, By the way, are you feeling better? Much better. Thank you for your concern, my lord husband, Yura replied. I'm much better. My lord husband, please be patient. In the nine-headed phoenix, nourishing one's spirit is an important etiquette. But we've been waiting for hours. Just as Eek's voice trailed off, the door suddenly opened with a click. He was slightly startled and raised his head, only to see Makarov standing outside with an expressionless face. Lord Makarov, why are you here? He was surprised. Makarov interrupted him. Don't ask so much, Eek. Abe's received a letter and one of them is for you. Your Highness? Yura asked. Hi, it's Count Tonajul. Eek jumped up in excitement. Great, I knew he wouldn't forget about me. Hurry up and give me the letter, Lord Makarov. All right, what's written in the letter? He was still somewhat rational and stopped to ask about the contents of the letter. Makarov glanced at him and shook his head. This future Duke Anthony grew up in the wilderness. Even though he received some noble education, he was still a mercenary in his bones. His mind was filled with a messy night's thoughts. What gave him a headache was that he didn't understand how he managed to raise such an heir to the feudal lord. He pondered for a moment before replying calmly, the letter says that we should go to Fort Valenda? Fort Valendon? Isn't that Duke Viro's hometown? Wait, why are the Count and the others going to Viro's province? I gasped in surprise. Isn't Count Randner still at war? Makarov stared at him in silence. The young man seemed to have realized that he had said something wrong and coughed. That? The news about Count Randner was... Yura was the one who told me. I definitely did not go out. My lord husband. Yura could not help but sigh heavily. He was a little too decisive in betraying his teammate. Author's note, your 10,000 strong baboons are here again. What happened to the votes? Recommendations? Collections? Subscriptions? To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 700. Half a month passed in the blink of an eye after the princess's messenger returned from Lantern Island with the news. The month of scrolls was an important month for the Bugas of the Silver City State. The White Tower rang its bell in this month, announcing the arrival of the month of knowledge and wisdom. Mages would publicly test their students in Gata or Nechidai's White Marble Square, causing the entire Silver City State to be shrouded in a tense yet orderly atmosphere. But for the people of Erewhon far away in Tonajul, it was just a month that was getting hotter and hotter. The crops in the fields were beginning to lose their leaves, and the color of the Abyss territory seemed to have changed into a pleasing green. Even though the astrologers and scholars in places like Bragg's and Ampere Seal were debating whether the month of July was related to people's logical ability in the system of Wond, its supporters and opponents had different opinions, but in reality, it had nothing to do with the production and life of the majority of the people in this kingdom. People were just sticking to the rules of their lives at this time of the year. The sun rose and set, day after day, that was all. The tension between the princess and Count Randner was becoming more and more obvious. The upcoming war was gradually brought up to the table and became the hottest topic after dinner. Although the Count had remained silent on this matter, everyone knew that their lord was firmly on the side of Her Royal Highness. Everyone knew that the Count was a young man, and the princess's beauty had long been known throughout the kingdom, even in Cruz's generation. Therefore, in private, some people in the south of Mentale and even the Frata region were secretly speculating about the relationship between Brando and Princess Griffin. Of course, the most popular rumors among the people were nothing more than the knight and the princess, or the count and his noble lover. In addition, the battle in Ampere Seal was like the plot of a knight's novel. Brando did not know how the news of him leading a group of retainers to Ampere Seal spread, but in short, most people would rather believe it to be true. As a result, the people around Her Royal Highness had been looking at him strangely for some time now. Griffin blushed slightly because the princess would occasionally mention these rumors, and reduced the number of times she met with him, which made Brando very depressed. Fortunately, the Roman did not seem to be jealous because of this. Instead, they listened to the bard's version of Brando's knight's deeds several times. Every time she heard the part where the count met the princess at night, she could not help but be especially curious. My lord, the growth of the World Tree Fortress is better than expected. A month after you left the territory, we built the Moon Tower. And with the Moon Tower's magic, the transmission energy of the vortex of light increased to 10, 20, 30, 50 times a month. By the month of summer. Monica's crisp voice interrupted Brando's thoughts. He froze for a moment and looked up at the canopy above his head. Valhalla's development was even better than he had imagined. The enormous tree shade was more than 10 times larger than the last time he had left. The palm-sized leaves stacked together to form a shade that was like a piece of jade. When the sunlight passed through them, the edges of the leaves would be dyed a warm bright yellow. Brando sat on the stairs in front of the town hall and listened to Monica's boring report. The report itself was actually concise and detailed, but the Lady of Light's painful way of counting was really difficult to correct. Fortunately, after his ears had been ravaged for a while, Brando gradually got used to this natural way of counting. He could not help but sigh at the powerful adaptability of humans. He raised his head and looked at the moon-white steeple above the canopy. The slender body of the steeple passed through the dense layers of shade and was covered with creepers. Under the shade, there were wooden lattice windows at intervals, making the entire steeple look unique and natural. There was a moon-shaped resonant crystal at the top of the tower. The crystal was glowing, proving that it was now working. This was Valhalla's moon tower, and it was located at the other end of the square. Brendel retracted his gaze, and the square between the town hall and the moon tower was no longer a mere 100 meters in diameter like when he first saw it, but more than 3 times larger. And compared to the last time he saw it, there was an additional fountain in the middle of the square. The fountain did not have any traces of artificial carving. Instead, it seemed to have grown out from the trunk below, surrounded by mushrooms. There was a statue of a young girl in the middle. Brando recognized that it should be the symbol of the goddess of spring. According to Monica, this statue should be a bonus building of Valhalla, but its function was very real. The whole fountain was like a weak magic halo that could replenish the magic power of all creatures and machines within 100 meters of it. The magic halo's function was very weak, but it had another function that Brando valued very much. That was, if one meditated near the fountain, the effect would be doubled. This was a great news for training wizards. It meant that if an apprentice practiced spells near the fountain, they would only need half the time to master a new spell. In fact, the Shire had already discovered this benefit. Brando saw many apprentices wearing monochromatic robes casting spells such as Magic Ball and Fire Arrow in the square. Some of them even formed 2 groups to fight against each other. The scene in the center of the square was like a group of people setting off fireworks, which was very pleasing to the eye. But since last month, the Lord the Shire has already taken back the authority of the Moon Tower. So, the number of transitions of the light vortex has returned to its original level. Monica finally finished counting. She flapped her wings and floated in front of Brando. She continued, "My lord, according to your request, we have upgraded Valhalla to a 1st, 2nd, 3rd level territory. At the same time we have also built the tree nest for defense. 1, 2, 3, 27 of them have already finished growing, and 1, 2, 3, 43 of them are still in the mature stage." She flew to the side and answered, "My lord, you can look over here." Brando moved the semi-transparent Lord's interface in front of him away. The drowsy data on it gave him a headache. He looked up and saw that in the direction Monica was pointing at, there were some knob-like objects growing on the tree trunks that extended outwards from the square. There were also some aerial roots that were as thick as the trunk of an ancient tree coiled around these knob-like objects. Just as he looked in that direction, some light green words appeared on the roots coiled around the trunks. They were, Ancient Tree Root, Parasitic Plant, HP, 40, Intelligence, Willpower, Wisdom, Strength, 22, Agility, 20, Constitution, 25. These ancient tree roots were almost at the level of Iron Peak, but he did not know how strong they were in actual combat. Brando could not help but look to the other side. Not far away, Haruz was wearing a knight's training suit and fighting with a root, but his sword skills were a little too horrible to look at. The vines suddenly swept across the ground, and the shy and adorable little prince fell to the ground with a somersault. Brando looked at the boy holding his red forehead and climbing up with a face that looked like he was about to cry. He could not help but sigh helplessly. "As long as you defeat this root, you can rest, your highness." He interrupted Monica and shouted, "I understand, teacher." The little prince looked grateful, and then he was unexpectedly whipped to the side of the square's parapet. Brando held his forehead, and for the first time, he wondered if he had misjudged her. He sighed and said, "Go on, Monica." According to Monica, each tree nest could nurture 10 of these roots, and when 70 tree nests were completed, there would be 700 to 800 of these roots in the periphery of Valhalla. That was equivalent to 700 to 800 elite soldiers of Erwin's White Lion Legion, or the Black Blade Legion's Flintlock Regiment. And Brando knew that this was only a comparison of strength, not to mention that these roots under the command of the World Tree Fortress were many times more tacit than human soldiers in terms of tactical cooperation. My lord, after the World Tree Fortress was upgraded to level 2, a new defensive building was added to the outer walls of the square and the second layer of the ring below, the Elven Arrow Tower. Because we did not receive authorization, you have to personally decide whether to build it, Monica replied. When she answered, there were light spirits flying around behind her at every moment, and each of these light spirits would greet the patriarch that Brando had personally appointed. In Brando's eyes, these light spirits flying around the world tree were like countless fireflies, embellishing the huge tree crown with a magical color. Elven Arrow Tower? Brando asked. This sounds like a city defense facility invented by the Silver Elves. There are 3 rooms on the top floor of the Elven Arrow Tower that can accommodate archers, and each room has 8 holes that can face in all directions. There are 2 types of magic formations in the room, Frost and Flame, which can easily enchant the archer's arrows. There is an ammunition room on the bottom 3 floors of the Arrow Tower, and a ballista room on the first floor that can accommodate 2 elven ballistas. Am I right? He looked up and asked. My lord, you're amazing. Monica couldn't help but widen her eyes and exclaim in a shrill voice. That's about right, but there's something wrong. The Elven Arrow Tower of the Silver Elves is actually derived from the Holy Spire of the Light Elves, and Valhalla's Arrow Tower is the same, and there are slight differences with the Silver Elves, but they are still in a parallel relationship. The Light Spirit Girl replied with some pride. Can I see the data first? Brando asked. Of course, my lord. Monica flew to the town hall and pulled out a long drawing from it. Brando glanced at the densely drawn drawing and couldn't help but shake his head. In fact, he didn't need this at all because when Monica said of course, a light screen had already appeared in front of him. A 3-dimensional model of the Elven Arrow Tower appeared on the light screen, and all aspects of this thing were marked on it. First of all, there were 3 archer rooms that were almost the same as the Silver Elves' Arrow Tower, and the 8 holes and 2 magic formations were clearly visible. Below was the ammunition room, and the arrows and ballista ammunition could be sent to the rooms above through a transmission spell. However, the ballista room below was slightly different from the Silver Elves' Arrow Tower in Brando's memory. From the model, this Elven Arrow Tower could only accommodate 1 ballista, but in the marking of the room's personnel, there was an additional allocation of a magic apprentice. Enchanted ballista. Brando pretended to grab the drawing and immediately reacted. As expected of his lordship, Monica praised in surprise. What an ingenious design. Brando also praised. However, in his heart, it might not necessarily be that Valhalla's Elven Arrow Tower was better than the Silver Elves. The increase in lethality of an enchanted ballista compared to 2 normal ballista was actually limited, but the allocation of a magic apprentice for 1 ballista seemed a little more extravagant. He muttered to himself for a while, and then he understood a little why Valhalla's various settings seemed to exist for the purpose of cultivating a large number of wizards. Now it seemed that this territory was very likely to be the legendary territory of a true high-level wizard. This kind of territory was admittedly powerful, but the cost of cultivating it was obviously astonishing. The front defense of Valhalla's Elven Arrow Tower was basically the same as the Silver Elves, and the side defense was slightly weaker, but it had a certain degree of self-recovery ability. Overall, each had its own merits. However, compared to the ordinary human's arrow towers made of earth and stone, these high-level magic arrow towers were naturally not on the same level. Overall, Brando was still very satisfied. Once Valhalla had this kind of defensive facility, the entire territory's defense could be said to have increased by several times. Brando immediately decided and asked, "This kind of arrow tower needs the support of a magic pool, right?" Monica nodded, "But there is no need to be so wasteful. The magic pool converted by the magic pool is enough to maintain the operation of these arrow towers. 1 crystal pool is enough to support 40 elven arrow towers to maintain the operation. And according to the Lord's request before you left, the crystal pool has already been completed 3 months ago. Then how many arrow towers do you think we need, Monica? If we build them on the top floor's plaza, we currently only need 8 to cover the entire area. If we build them on the second floor, we need 20. If we were to build it on top of the root city, we would need at least 70 or more. Furthermore, if Sir Overlord chooses the last option, Sir Odin is currently building a wall there, so it will take a lot of time." The outer ring that Monica spoke of was actually the outer layer of the world tree's trunk. After the world tree had fully matured, it would form 3 regions. The central plaza with a diameter of 500 meters was the highest and most core area, and almost all the functional buildings surrounded this huge plaza. Below the plaza, about 30 meters down, was a 50-meter wide circular path. This circular path circled around the world tree. From top to bottom there were a total of 2 levels. The lower level led to the upper level, while the upper level led to the hollow inner hall of the world tree on the side of the wall. Below the 2 rings was an open region formed by countless Valhalla's roots. This region was undulating, roughly 2 to 3,000 meters in diameter. There were many flat spaces formed above, and there were roots as wide as great roads connecting them. This was precisely Valhalla's lower city area. However, there was no wall in the lower city. Instead, a descendant of a rune dwarf suddenly had the idea of building a man-made fortress in this area. This was the first time Brando had heard of this idea. He could not help but stand up and ask, "Odin plans to build another wall in the lower city? Wait, is he crazy? What if Valhalla expands further? Lord, after the core area of Valhalla reaches its current diameter, it will stabilize for a period of time. After all, the World Tree Fortress will not grow endlessly." Monica replied. What about the future? Brando still felt that it was a little unbelievable. The last time that guy said that he wanted to build an invincible city, without a gate, he felt that he should have noticed the problem. He did not expect Odin to be even more lawless this time. However, Monica clearly had a different opinion from him. "My lord, the World Tree Fortress is a magic territory. Perhaps you have not seen its magical aspects, but you don't have to worry. Even if it continues to expand in the future, it will not affect the old city at all. At most, you can just expand the lower city when the time comes." Really? Brando frowned at the mention of territory. Not to mention a territory of Valhalla's level, he had never even seen a popular magic territory of the players. In this aspect he was still a complete newbie. Of course, if every time Valhalla expands, the entire territory will be overturned and rebuilt. How can such a World Tree Fortress be called the strongest fortress from the previous era? Monica replied proudly. The strongest fortress? Brando keenly grasped this adjective. Initially he thought that the light spirit was just blowing her own trumpet, but to his surprise she nodded solemnly and said, "My lord, I'm sure you don't know the origin of this territory. Once you know why it was built, you'll understand that what Monica said is true." "What is its origin?" Brando narrowed his eyes and asked curiously. Monica was slightly stunned, then suddenly changed her expression and replied in a mechanical tone. "The Hall of Valhalla, the Palace of Gold, Asgard, the Utopia Avalon and Otteras, the first, second, third, fourth and fifth fortresses were originally replicas of Babel Fortress. After the Battle of Dusk they were used in succession, but as far as I know the Palace of Gold, Asgard, and the Utopia Avalon have been completely destroyed, and only one copy of Valhalla is left. Otteras is missing. But as a replica of the final battlefield, although it is only a copy, the remaining Valhalla is already a symbol of the greatest masterpiece of that era's civilization. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation." Chapter 701. Hearing Monica's mechanical tone, Brando was almost stunned. He could not help but blurt out, "Valhalla is a replica of Babel. Monica, do you know the legend of the era of the gods?" Monica came back to her senses and quickly shook her head. Her tone returned to normal. "No, my lord, I don't know." "Wait, then how do you know this?" "No, I don't know either, but ever since the World Tree Fortress was upgraded, as one of the people in charge of it, this knowledge seems to have automatically appeared in my mind." The light spirit girl hurriedly replied, "But I can't say anything more." Brando was slightly startled and calmed down. "In other words, Valhalla is very likely a creation from the era of the gods?" "I'm not sure about that, my lord." "Forget it, at least we know that it's ours, that's enough." Brando waved his hand and decided not to dwell on these messy questions. Let's go back to the original topic. Since that's the case, I only plan to build elven arrow towers on the ring road. That's why I only need to build 20 arrow towers, Monica. I understand, my lord. However, the territory now needs more magic power and resources. I'm afraid that what you gave us earlier is not enough. Monica replied respectfully, "Thanks to Sir Overlord, Valhalla grew very quickly." Brando clenched his teeth. It would have been better if Monica did not mention this, but once she did, he remembered the mountains of colorless and transparent crystals he saw under the World Tree. These things were an example of the wealth this World Tree Fortress had consumed in the past half a year. But this was only the beginning. On the list, each arrow tower required nearly 200,000 magic power, as well as a huge amount of resources. Magic power could be converted into crystals, but resources had to be transported from the territory one by one. He could not help but groan in his heart. From now on, the magic crystals produced by the Black Forest will double from 20%. In terms of resources, I will let Yuta and Amandina satisfy you first. Thank you so much, my lord. Light Spirit Monica flew around excitedly in the sky. It was obvious that she had said so much just for this sentence. However, Brando knew better than her how expensive it was to build a high-grade magic territory. The Elven Arrow Tower was just the beginning. With the Elven Arrow Towers, they would first need archers and ballistas, followed by wizards and magic apprentices. All of these required money. Brando rubbed his forehead and asked, "How's the wind archer training going, Monica?" "I was just about to stop here, Sir Lord." Monica immediately replied, "The construction of the Wind Archers Hall has already been completed. The first batch of soldiers to be trained are mainly tree elves from the Loop of Trade Winds. After that, we took in some elves from other places such as Wind Elf mercenaries and Wild Elf refugees from the north. However, from the third batch onwards, humans became the main source of soldiers. However, from the completion of the training, the elves are still the best potential wind archers. This wasn't out of Brando's expectations. There weren't many elves in the human world, let alone in a place like Tanajil. As for the fact that the elves were much more talented than humans, this was also reasonable. However, when he heard Monica say that there were 465 tree elf wind archers, 187 elven wind archers, and 160 human wind archers, he couldn't help but be stunned for a moment. He turned around and asked, "Why are there so few humans? Is it because the elimination rate is too high?" "This is also one of the reasons, my lord." At this moment, a voice interrupted. Brando heard this familiar voice and turned around. As expected, he saw Falerne walking over with a straight face. The wild elf girl came to his side with a few scrolls of parchment and replied, "However, the main reason is because of the strange rule that my lord set. Only girls can become wind archers. Most of the humans in Tanajil are refugees, and there are already very few females. Those who meet the requirements in terms of physique and age are even fewer. Coupled with the elimination rate, those who are left are naturally very rare." The wild elf sister glanced at her lord. Her current attire was very different from before. Ever since she became the White City Vanguard, her attire had changed from the original mercenary uniform to the more formal elementalist robes. However, the robes were still monochromatic due to the large drop in level. She then said, "Now, everyone in the territory already knows about my lord's special hobby. Although it is normal for a normal man to have such fantasies, Falerne also hopes that my lord can pay attention to your own reputation." "What?" Brando was stunned. "When did I set such a rule?" He suddenly thought of something and couldn't help but run to the tree wall to take a look. As expected, he saw a large group of elven and human archers training in the direction of the Wind Archers Hall. They were all women. Furthermore, all of them were women with high aptitude. He was almost dazzled by the sight. Brando hurriedly took a deep breath and turned around to ask, "What's going on?" He never dreamed that after not asking about the development of Valhalla for a few months, this damned World Tree Fortress had built a real army of women for him. Of course, it wasn't that this was bad. Brando certainly hoped that his subordinates could be more pleasing to the eye. However, as an army, men were indeed more convenient than women in many aspects. This. Monica hesitated for a moment before answering. The Wind Archers of Valhalla were originally inherited from the Silver Elf Princess Guards, so... Brando immediately shut up. He of course knew what the Silver Elf Princess Guards were. The name of the Princess Guards actually didn't mean that this army was the Silver Fairy Princess Guards. The name was actually a metaphor because every warrior in this army of archers was the most outstanding female Silver Elf. According to the setting of the Amber Sword, it could even be said that this army was the female Amazons in Won's history. After hearing Monica's words, he couldn't help but be slightly stunned. He probably never dreamed that he would inherit such an army. "The Princess Guards," he subconsciously asked, "does Valhalla's Wind Archers have the same combat power as the Princess Guards in history? That was an army of the same level as the Dragon King's cavalry?" "Of course not." Monica immediately dispelled his expectations. "The Wind Archers are after all only the first level of Valhalla's troop class. In terms of form, it can only be said to be a simplified version of the Princess Guards." "Then what ability does it have?" Brando asked. "My lord, you will know when you see it for yourself." In fact, Brando didn't need Monica's reminder. He was already looking in that direction. On the lower ring behind the Wind Archers Hall was a huge training ground. The first batch of Tree Elf Wind Archers were divided into several groups and fighting against each other. Brando immediately saw the figures of the female elves faintly discernible. In his knowledge, there was only one type of spell effect that had such characteristics. Invisibility? Yes, the Wind Archers are a typical field unit. Their greatest ability is that they can continuously go invisible for a short period of time during battle, or go invisible for a long period of time before battle. But now, the Wind Archers of Valhalla are equipped with the Wind Archer armor that my lord personally designed. In fact, they also have the ability to fly and glide for a short period of time. Almighty Martha! Brando could not help but feel a burst of joy when he heard this. It was easy to imagine how useful the Wind Archers who were proficient in invisibility were on the battlefield. One of the biggest weaknesses of the Wind Archers on the battlefield was their lack of close combat ability, and they were easily discovered. Generally speaking, once the Wind Archers' formation was approached by the cavalry, it would immediately collapse. But the Wind Archers were completely different. They did not even need protection. Once they were approached, they would immediately use the flying ability provided by the Wind Archer's cloak to open up a distance, and then use invisibility to hide themselves and wait for the next shot. Heavens! Brando could imagine how terrifying that would be. The only problem now was that there were too few of them, or else they would be of great use in this war. He suddenly thought of something and turned around to ask, "Falern, is there any news from Count Randner?" "Not this time, my lord." Falern maintained the same expression as she replied, "This time it's about a certain lord of Madara. Someone from Silverman's side who was indebted to my lord sent a messenger back with news. Just as my lord predicted, the undead army has begun to gather in Yusong." Bloodstaff. Brando closed the lord interface and stood up. "The undead army has begun to move, which means that Count Randner should be leaving soon. It's a little earlier than I expected. It seems that Duke Arek must have made some new progress that made him feel pressured." "Her Highness asked when you are leaving, my lord?" Falern replied. "Yes, my lord." "Her Highness." Brando paused for a moment. There was a sudden commotion at the side of the square. He looked up and saw the princess leading a group of people over from the Tower of the Moon. They must have entered the hall at the center of the World Tree and came to the square. The princess walked past the center of the square with a few maids. She glanced at her younger brother who was tightly bound by the roots of the ancient tree. It was only then that Brendel noticed that the little prince seemed to have completely succumbed to the tyrannical power of the tentacles. His little face was red from being strangled, his sword was bounced away and he was panting there. Princess Griffin could not help but frown when she saw this scene and shook her head. She walked up to Brando, took a deep breath and greeted him softly. "It's been a few days since we last met. Mr. Brando is still as energetic as ever." "Your Highness." Brando was a little embarrassed. After all, he had tortured someone else's younger brother, the future king of the kingdom, into such a state. It would be fine if the princess did not see it, but he did not expect her to see it. "I'm not here to talk about this, Count." The princess shook her head. "I'm here to say goodbye. By the way, I want to ask, when do you plan to leave for Viro?" "Goodbye?" Brando was startled. "I plan to go back to Frata first. Oberway and Anthony's envoys are still waiting for me there. In addition, Mr. Eek and his fiancée have sent news. They left for Fort Valendon yesterday. Duke Anthony has given him full authority to act on behalf of Anthony." She paused for a moment. "So I don't have much time left." Brando finally understood. He was silent. In fact, when he received news about the undead's movements from Falern, he knew that the time was ripe. But he did not expect the princess to come so soon. "Mr. Brando, are you going to leave for Frata with me?" The half-fairy princess paused and asked again. To be able to travel with the eldest princess, Brendel naturally couldn't wait. But he hesitated for a moment and finally shook his head. "No, there's no need. Your Highness, I have other things to do. You can go ahead and wait for me to meet you at Fort Valendon." Princess Griffin looked at him, and there was no surprise in her silver eyes. In fact, she already knew where Brando was going. She pondered for a moment. "Are you going to take those cruise people?" "Yes." Brando nodded. In a sense, going to the Stained Frost Forest was to help the cruise people, so of course he had to take these guys with him. But most of those cruise night were burdens. He thought for a moment and replied, "I just need to take Lorena and her fiancé. Veronica should be there to meet me." "Can you make it?" the princess asked. "I should be able to." Brando nodded. Although the Stained Frost Forest Labyrinth was a legendary dungeon, it wasn't actually that big. Besides, he didn't have to fight the monsters inside. The best scenario was that Arek had already gotten the heart of the dragon, and then he just had to snatch it from the hands of the cultists. There was no psychological burden. "Then I'll leave it to you." Princess Griffin looked at him, the meaning of trust in her eyes was very obvious. She whispered, "I'll leave Magadal to you. Don't worry, Your Highness, Princess Magadal is also my friend. I understand, Mr. Brando. Then I'm relieved. But I have a presumptuous request, Your Highness. Brando suddenly said. He looked at the future Princess Regent of Erewhon and hesitated. To be honest, he wasn't sure if she would agree to his request. Actually, there are two requests. First, I hope this time Freya will be the commander of Frada's army. Second, I hope this time Prince Haruz can go with me to the Stained Frost Forest. Once Brando said this, the surroundings immediately quieted down. The princess was silent for a moment. I've already said the first request, Mr. Brando. The military command of both territories will be handed over to you. As for who will be their commander, it's also up to you to decide. As for the second request. The half-elf princess was silent for a moment. After all, that was her only brother. She gave all her hope that he could support the kingdom. Of course, she hoped that Haruz could be stronger, but this didn't mean that she could easily let her brother take risks. Although Brando didn't say it, she also knew the danger of the Stained Frost Forest. After all, it was still within the Erewhon Kingdom. Most of the disasters in the Viro province came from the direction of the Falling Needle Hills. As the princess of a kingdom, it was impossible for her not to have heard of these rumors. Can I know the reason? Finally she asked softly. Brando hesitated for a moment. Of course, he couldn't say that he wanted to bring the little prince to clear dungeons and get some equipment to accumulate some experience. At the same time, it would be best if he could become more independent. He thought for a moment and finally replied, I think Haruz, His Royal Highness, he needs a little training. Can't he do it somewhere else? Griffin frowned. Of course, but there's not much time left for us. Since there's this opportunity now, I think maybe we should let go and let him go on his own path. Brando replied seriously. He looked back at the little prince who was tied up tightly and asked, His Royal Highness Prince Haruz, are you afraid? The little prince was about to cry from being strangled, but he looked at his sister and then looked at this terrible teacher. In the end, he could only say pitifully, I'm not afraid. Griffin looked at her brother and couldn't help but sigh. Of course, she understood that her brother was not willing. But because of this, she hardened her heart and nodded seriously. I understand, Mr. Brando. I'll leave Haruz to you. Haruz looked at his sister with tears in his eyes. At that moment, the pitiful look made Brando wonder if he didn't take him from his sister, but was abandoned by the princess. But the princess was obviously more cold-hearted than Brando thought. She didn't even look at her brother and said to Brando, Then I'll take my leave, Brando. Brando nodded, slightly moved. There was no doubt that for the current princess, Haruz was undoubtedly one of the most important people to her. She put the little prince in his hands, even more important than giving him the keystone. It could be said that if something happened to Haruz, her persistence and hope would be worthless. Brando turned around. Pharaoh, go tell Miss Freya to get ready, we're ready to go. He ordered succinctly. P.S. At the last moment of the update, the backend of Chidien actually lagged. I really want to die at the starting point, your strong baboons should go to hell. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 702. Northward of Castle Kirkle, the capital of the province of Grinoires, and into its confluence with Lantanailan and Viro, the town of Shallow Water had sat quietly on the western shore of Lake Valendon for centuries, ever since it was founded by Count Hadinger in the Year of Revelation. The coniferous forests of Grinoires that stretched to the north presented a completely different scene here. Large patches of cedar trees were scattered in the woodlands, and even though it was near summer, frost still fell from the treetops as the group passed through the forest road. The closer they got to Shallow Water Town, the more obvious the signs of the so-called late spring in the northern part of Viro became. The blazing hot summer was nowhere to be found here, and instead, the signs of the recovery of all things were slow to arrive in this area. The air in the forest was still wrapped in the chill of the end of winter, and the sky was so gray that it made one's chest feel stuffy, as if the mountain god of the sky, Jianghu, was stirring a layer of lime above the clouds. Brando sat on horseback and looked up. The forest was bare, and the thin branches between the tree trunks were like dense spiderwebs that stretched to the sky. The buds that sprouted in the new year were still covered with a thin layer of fluff, and a few withered leaves from the end of the previous year hung quietly under these buds. From afar, they looked like dry pupae that swayed slightly in the cold wind. But this was not the month of recovery, but the scene of the hot August in late summer. Such a spectacle made everyone in the group click their tongues in amazement. It was clearly the month of flowing fire, but this place looked like the transition between winter and spring. Philas rode at the front of the group and sighed, Is this scenery caused by the so-called stained frost forest? His loud voice echoed in the forest, startling a gray deer in the woods, which greatly displeased the guides in front of him. It was said that it was bad luck to annoy the holy spirits in the forest, and these nobles were all so ignorant and reckless. However, the local hunters wouldn't go as far as to argue with the nobles over such a trivial matter. Hence they managed to live in peace along the way. To Philas, the lucky knight from the Kurlutz Empire had finally gotten rid of his status as a prisoner, and the 10 days of prison life had bored him to death. However, he did not care about his previous experience and only treated it as a misunderstanding. This kind of open-minded personality won him the favor of everyone, because after he was released from the prison, he was treated as a guest of honor. On the other hand, Miss Delphian was much more stubborn. Even though she was not imprisoned in the water dungeon, Freya persuaded her, and perhaps because she did not want to make enemies everywhere, Amandina secretly locked the Prime Minister's daughter in the upper levels of the dungeon and separated her from the other prisoners. A week later she was taken away by Veronica's men. However, before she left, the lady did not feel the slightest bit of regret. Instead she scolded Brando. Brando really had nothing to say to such a stubborn lunatic. He could only leave it to Veronica to deal with it herself. If the Legion lady was smart enough, he felt that she should be sent back to her country as soon as possible. Philas looked around and suddenly pulled the reins to a stop. He turned back and asked, "Count, how far is it from here to the stained frost forest?" Lorena frowned and answered before Brando could, "It's still very far. I checked the map. It's at least a week's journey." "So far?" Philas exclaimed, "According to our itinerary, this is about the distance between the Flowerleaf Ridge and the Alfalfa Wilderness. Is it equivalent to saying that the changes in the four-leaf clover forest can affect Vahaina?" He first made a stifled analogy, then sighed, "If the climate can be changed at this distance, wouldn't the trees in the center of the stained frost forest be frozen into ice crystals?" "Pretty much," Brando replied. Although he had only been to the stained frost forest once, he was still very impressed with it. In addition, he had read a lot of relevant guides later, so he could be said to know it like the back of his hand. Although the stained frost forest labyrinth had a forest in its name, it was actually a glacier or an ice cave inside. There were more frost monsters than he had seen later in St. Tassol and Fanzan. "It's really scary," Philas couldn't help but shiver. "Are we going to just plunge into the ice and snow forest over there? Aren't we going to buy some warm clothes or something along the way?" "We already have, Mr. Philas," Medisha replied with a smile as she followed behind Brando on her unicorn. She also used her eyes to signal the only carriage in the middle of the group, which was piled full of supplies. The little prince, who had been sent to run back and forth beside the wagon, and with the hired local coachman, endeavored to keep it steady over the rutted road, and was heard to bray in a clear voice to the 4 thick-haired ponies, who paid no heed to him, but looked at him with a kind of contempt with their 8 eyes. Everyone couldn't help but feel a little amused and sympathetic at the same time. But fortunately, Haruz was starting to get used to it. He raised his head and wiped his sweat, his face flushed. He was wearing a brand new leather armor with a long sword strapped to his back. He looked like a young knight who had gone to a great noble house as an attendant, where was the image of the little prince in his brocade robe from before. "Oh, I remember now," Philas suddenly realized and nodded to himself. "Philas," Brando turned around at this time and asked, "have you ever gone on a winter hunt in your hometown? I heard that the Barano area is one of the most well-developed areas in the empire, and Pesa and Friar are both important commercial towns. There are very few such forests in the area your father rules, right?" The Count is so knowledgeable. Hearing someone mention his hometown to him, Philas suddenly had a better impression of the Count of Tanajil. Besides, Brando was right, he obviously knew a lot about geography and culture. He immediately opened his mouth. "Exactly, but it's not like I haven't participated in a winter hunt. There were a few times when my father and I were invited to Floral Leaf territory to participate in the winter hunt held by the Archduke of Floral Leaf. After all, the winter hunt is a very important event for nobles, both a tradition and an important social event. That's where I met Lorena." "I see." Brando saw the female knight blushing and knew that Philas was telling the truth. He also sighed inwardly. So they were childhood sweethearts. No wonder Philas could defeat so many challengers and win the beauty's heart. Plus, this guy's character was really not bad, and he could be considered to have some personal charm, at least compared to the children of the nobles, so it was no wonder Lorena chose him. He nodded on horseback and pretended to say inadvertently, "Actually, Mr. Philas can see our operation as a hunt, except that our opponents are more dangerous." "Really?" Philas seemed to be energized. Now that the Count says so, I seem to be a little eager to try. That's good, Brando smiled slightly. The Shire saw his lord smile and understood that someone was about to fall into a trap. He couldn't help but look at the young man with some sympathy. I have a presumptuous request. If Mr. Philas doesn't mind, I'll leave the task of cleaning up the battlefield and organizing the spoils to you. Philas looked overjoyed. In the etiquette of the nobles, only the most distinguished guests had the right to be the first to touch and distribute the prey. He never dreamed that the legendary lord would think so highly of him. After all, it was unlikely that the other party was concerned about his identity, because just half a month ago, Brando had mercilessly imprisoned him and the daughter of the Prime Minister of the Empire. It was obvious that the name of the Cruz Empire was worthless in the eyes of the Count. However, it was precisely because of this contrast that he felt a little flattered and replied, "Since my lord is so fond of me, then I shall respectfully accept." For a moment, the young man was obviously a little confused by Brando's flattery, and even the way he addressed him had unknowingly changed. Lorena looked at her fiancé and couldn't help but shake her head, then looked up at Brando and said, "Thank you very much for thinking so highly of me, Count." "It's okay." Brando returned the gesture courteously on the surface, his expression calm and collected. In fact, he was laughing in his heart. He didn't bring the couple with him to meet up with Veronica or anything. In the final analysis, he took a fancy to the other's luck, which was as good as Martha's own son. Compared to the luckiest knight in Cruz's history, Pharaoh's lucky hand was probably nothing, not to mention that the wild elf sister didn't seem to be very willing to help him with this matter now. He could almost imagine the days of wealth in the future. If Philas wasn't the eldest son of the Prince of the Cruz Empire, he would probably have thought of detaining the other party permanently. Of course, it wasn't as if he didn't have such thoughts now. And with the previous conversation between Brando and Philas, the atmosphere in the convoy suddenly became harmonious, and the conversation gradually became much more casual. But Brando still noticed an exception. He turned his head. The convoy moved along the main road with a clanking sound, and the shadows of people moving about. The afternoon sun dyed the whole forest a dreamy color as it passed through the branches. But among the crowd, Freya rode alone at the very edge of the convoy, as if in an independent world. She lowered her head, holding the slate in her hand and looking at it over and over. It was a weather-stained slate, its brownish-yellow surface covered with coarse grains, somewhat similar to the weathered granite on the Great Plains of Kramasu. A mysterious symbol was painted on the front and back of the slate with white paint. The paint itself looked like lime that faded easily, but wiping it by hand proved the opposite. Apart from this, Freya hadn't seen anything unusual on it in the past few days. She didn't know why Brando gave this slate to her, saying that it was something that belonged to her, and that one day she would discover the secrets on it and other inexplicable things like that. But all these days the slate was still a slate and hadn't changed at all. The girl couldn't help but frown slightly, but in her heart she wondered if this was another prank by Brando. He always seemed to like to make fun of her. But the girl from the countryside of Bucci hesitated again, and in the end she couldn't bear to throw away the slate. What if it was true? This was something that Brando had personally given to her, and for it, he had traveled so far, the two of them. Because of this, she held the stone a little awkwardly, and couldn't help but be lost in thought for a moment. She didn't even notice that someone had approached her. Brando gently touched the future Valkyrie's elbow from the side. "Freya? Whom?" The familiar voice made the girl turn around with a start, and she asked in shock, "Boo, Brando, what's wrong?" Brando frowned at the future Valkyrie, and of course, her flustered attitude couldn't be hidden from anyone. "What are you thinking?" "I'm just trying to find out the secret of this stone. Brando, what exactly is this?" Freya's face was slightly red, and of course she was embarrassed to say that she had been thinking the wrong way before. But fortunately, the country girl still had some quick wit, and hurriedly held up the slate in her hand and asked doubtfully. Brando glanced at the slate in her hand. This slate was called a key in some occasions in the Amber Sword, but it was actually just a replica of the war slate. Most of these slates were passed down between the Myurnas or even older prehistoric civilizations, and were used to record the information of the real war slate. But there were also some records of ancient secrets and some records of the history, culture, and war before the War of the Holy Saints. Players had unearthed many such slate fragments in the past, and most of the background records about Tumen, the Dark Dragon, and the War of the Holy Saints were deciphered by players through such text. But the one he gave to Freya was particularly different. In the game, this slate had a deep relationship with Freya. In that turbulent history, the title of Valkyrie, which represented recognition and praise of Freya's strength, was not an honorific title given to the Valkyrie by the players of Erewhon, nor was it even a title given by the kingdom itself. But from Cruz to Saint Tassol, and even in Madara, even her enemies gave her this title. Of course, this was not just because of her personal charm. And most of the reason was because of Freya's Valkyrie mark. The mark on her forehead, which looked like a holy flame, would appear whenever the Valkyrie was in danger or when she tried her best, and it would be accompanied by a pair of huge light wings. In such a state, the power of the Valkyrie would often show a geometric increase. It was said that this sign first appeared during a competition in the Royal Knight Academy. This was also one of the main reasons why he insisted that Freya go to the Royal Knight Academy. And after that, the frequency of the Valkyrie mark appearing became higher and higher, and in those battles where thousands or even tens of thousands of people fought, it was obviously impossible to hide this secret. In the original history, Freya's power was first announced by players in the first battle against the North. After that, the title of Valkyrie followed her like a shadow. But other than that, more players began to search for the hidden secret. And the one who finally deciphered this secret was the player who discovered this slate. Brando could not even remember the player's ID, but he clearly remembered the whole incident from beginning to end. It should be not long after the Second War of the Black Roses. More and more copies of the war slate were widely discovered from all over the world, and players began to spontaneously decipher the content on the slate. At the same time, the history of the War of the Holy Saints became clearer and clearer in front of everyone. But from this slate that was discovered in Tanajul, the player who discovered it interpreted a completely different record. It was neither about the history of the War of the Holy Saints, nor was it a description of a certain war or a certain myth. Instead, it repeatedly mentioned the existence of the Valkyrie mark. And at the end of the slate, there was a vague mention about the way to activate the bloodline of the Valkyrie. The player who discovered this slate at first thought that it was a quest item to obtain a high-level bloodline, but after he tried all kinds of methods and still failed to obtain the next step of the quest, he finally thought of the Valkyrie of Erewhon. So he posted his experience and the contents of this slate on the forum. Not long after that, the slate was bought by others at a high price, and then it came to Freya. Brando remembered that it should be the silver year of the first era. Not long after that, the Valkyrie of Erewhon mastered the ability to freely enter the state of the Valkyrie. Until just before she died in battle. But seriously speaking, Brando himself did not know how to use this slate. He only knew the original location of this slate and some of its subsequent experiences from the news circulating on the internet. But at least he was sure that this was what it was, and it would definitely have an effect on Freya. He thought for a moment and asked, "Do you trust me, Freya?" Of course I trust you, Brando." Freya was slightly stunned, and then she seemed to understand what Brando meant. She looked at the slate in her hand and nodded helplessly. "I understand. I will keep it well. You don't have to think too much about it. Maybe at some point you will naturally discover its secret." Brando grabbed the reins and rode side by side with the Valkyrie. But since Freya was troubled, he could only comfort her. "Brando, you are becoming more and more like a Roman ant. You can just say that I am becoming more and more like a fraud. I can accept that." Brando replied helplessly. Freya glanced at him and smiled at him. "But it's good that you haven't changed at all since then. Sometimes I am afraid that you will no longer be Brando after you become a noble." The girl from Bucci turned her head and said quietly, "I haven't changed, but you have." Brando nodded. "You have become more mature." What? The Valkyrie blushed a little. "You wouldn't say such things in the past. You would most likely say, 'Brando, why have you become so strange?' Brando? You are too much." To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 703. In fact, the convoy had spent the whole morning fighting the Lakeside Avenue on the west bank of Lake Valendon, which had been in disrepair for many years. This prosperous trade route about 30 years ago had become a mess after Oberg VII ascended to the throne. But it had been fine recently because they had lost track of the caravans. At least there were no bandits around. All in all, the convoy had been busy the whole morning. Everyone did not even have time to eat lunch. They only arrived at Shallow Water Town in the afternoon. At around 3 o'clock, Brando could see the outline of a town sitting by the lake through the reflection of the lake. It shone under the sun. That was Shallow Water Town. Shallow Water Town had a long history in Awen. Ever since Count Hadinger bought this land from the mountain people in the last century, the immigrants had started to settle down here permanently. At first, It was mainly provided as a place for adventurers to settle down in the Falling Needle Hills. Later, it gradually became a transportation route connecting Viro, Grimoires, and Lantern Island. Therefore, the town had maintained many historic inns for thousands of years. For example, Brando was familiar with Nissa's Butterfly Flower and Trout Pond. But in the game, Shallow Water Town's position was not important. One important reason was that it was the gateway to Lantern Island, and Lantern Island was rarely open to ordinary players. Secondly, the only high-level area nearby was the Falling Needle Hills. From this direction, one had to pass through the northern section of the Ansara Forest. The mountain path was very difficult, so players would rather go through Valendon than this direction. After all, players could still use the teleportation circle, so the distance was not too big of a problem. This situation continued until Veston's castle dungeon was opened. The 9 Phoenix Swords Golden Ice Flame appeared, and a large number of players flocked to this place. But the good times did not last long. Not long after that was the Third War of the Black Roses, and what happened after that was known to everyone. Thinking of this, Brando could not help but look up at the mountains. The Golden Sparrow Mountains and Ansara Sapphire Mountains intersected here. The 2 largest mountains in the east were their respective main peaks. Below the mountains was the Bachanier Pass, and north from there Veston's castle was hidden in the forest. The legendary Golden Ice Flame Holy Sword was hidden under the castle. That was one of Brando's targets, but he didn't plan to touch it for the time being. Speaking of which, there were so many advanced areas near the Falling Needle Hills. Who knew what the designer was thinking? He knew that a real adult dragon was guarding the Golden Ice Flame in Veston's castle. He didn't know what the relationship between the winter dragon named Katina and the one in the Falling Needle Hills was, but her strength was several orders of magnitude stronger than that of the young dragon. If Brando went to find trouble with her now, it was basically the same concept as courting death. Fortunately, Weiss Castle had been sealed for a long time, so no one would touch it for the time being. Brando looked in the direction of Shallow Water Town. This place was the front line of the resistance against Madara for a long time, and it left a deep impression on him. He and his senior sister's exploration team had once fought and bled here. Many places still retained fragments of memories of him fighting side by side with those familiar companions. They could see familiar scenes and locations in every street and alley they passed through, and they couldn't help but sigh with emotion. The carriage passed through the nearest road to Shallow Water Town and entered the town. As the nearby area was relatively peaceful, they were not interrogated. Shallow Water Town was under the jurisdiction of Duke Anthony. The Duke's rule was very strict. Even in such a remote place, it was rare to see a scene similar to Grimoires where the private army of the nobles was as fierce as bandits. Finally, the carriage stopped in the middle of the commercial area in the north of the town. Brando specifically chose an inn far away from the docks. The name of the inn was not outstanding. It was called the House of Carriages. In Erewhon and Wonde you could find similar inns with the same name. There was no connection between them. The only connection was probably that the owners were equally lazy when it came to naming things. This inn was also unknown in the game. Even Brando had never heard of it. But he chose this place for 2 reasons. First, to avoid the noise of the docks. Second, to avoid the familiar residents that reminded him of the past. Those fragmented memories that were like broken mirrors were like scars to him. Every time they were uncovered, it was like opening a scar. After arranging the carriage, they walked into the inn. The business of this inn, called the House of Carriages, was as quiet as Brando imagined. Even the owner of the inn probably did not expect to have a big customer. The bald, middle-aged man, who was immersed in wiping a plate with a dirty rag on the bar, was stunned for a moment when the light at the door dimmed slightly. He looked up and narrowed his eyes to see Brando walking into the inn first, followed by Faraz and the female knight, Lorena. Then Medisha and the Shire followed behind. Freya followed with a slate in her hand. Next to her was Hippamera in a linen robe. The priestess was bare-armed, but she did not seem to have any problem in such cold weather. He did not know if it was the blessing of the mountain spirit from Himalid that had taken effect, or if the life of an ascetic had made her accustomed to such harsh conditions. Last was Scarlet and the little prince who had just come out of the stable. Haruz, after a tiring morning, followed behind the mercenary girl dejectedly, like an abused child laborer. Brando did not bring too many people with him on this trip, because the place he was going to was too dangerous, and those who lacked strength would go in vain. So in addition to the necessary entourage, Brando only brought his own cards. In addition to these people, Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles, Babasha, her witches and Alaz, who were ready to meet them at the Falling Needle Hills, there were only a little more than 10 people in total. But there was an uninvited presence in this group. While the owner was still squinting at his group, Brando could not help but look back at the person who had been silently following behind the group. Until now she had not said a single word to him. She just followed him silently. But for the sake of the princess, he really could not take the initiative to ask her anything. After everyone had walked into the inn, the bald innkeeper seemed to finally react and confirmed that such a large group of people did not seem to be here to collect debts from him. He was stunned for a moment before asking, "Are you here to stay? Do you have any other services besides accommodation? Isn't this an inn?" Before Brando could speak, Philas asked somewhat incomprehensibly, "No, of course it is. Now welcome." The bald innkeeper jumped up as if the soles of his feet were on fire. "Do you need a room? There are still many empty rooms in my inn. I guarantee you will be satisfied." "It's not just rooms." Brando finally spoke, "There's also food. We just came from Kirkle, cold and hungry, do you understand? Yeah, the ground is cold and hard at night in this damn place. Tents and sleeping bags won't do. I can finally get a good night's sleep today and there's food." Philas could not help but interject excitedly, "I want roasted venison, preferably roasted with charcoal from the alfalfa fields, roasted until it's oily and paired with spices, preferably spices from Luke. If not, I can accept Saint Tassol's herbs and salt. Then give me a jar of honey butter cake, baked herring, a cup of pure black tea from Rushta's House of Gold after dinner, and—" The knight from Cruz was talking excitedly as if he had already drawn up a pie to appease his hunger. But Brando quickly interrupted him before he could say anything more outrageous, and said to the stunned bald innkeeper, "Listen to him, roasted venison. If you don't have it, the trout pond should have it for sale at this time of the year. You can buy it. Go out from here and turn left twice until you reach the end of the street. I'm sure you've heard of that place. As for the rest, just pretend you didn't hear it. But you can buy some seafood from Lake Valendon, for example the mullet and salmon that are in season, and make us a few passable dishes. I can pay you double for those, and if you can get honey I'll give you another reward. Also, the ladies will need some fruit wine to warm them up." Brando glanced at the young prince, "and a cup of goat's milk. I don't care what you do. Don't try anything funny with me. I know the rules here better than you do, got it?" The bald innkeeper shuddered slightly, and then realized that the man in front of him was an old hand, and seemed to know the town better than he did. He could not help but take another look at Brando. Brando's southern aristocratic attire was a little strange to him. Logically speaking, someone who could say something like that should not be a noble, but one of those mercenaries or adventurers who traveled all year round. But the bald innkeeper did not dare to be rash, and quickly excused himself, instructing the waiter to carry out Brando's request. Brando turned around and everyone looked at him with a little surprise. Whether it was Medisha, the Shire, Freya, Scarlet, or even Pahimera who had just joined the team, everyone more or less knew that this count was knowledgeable, and was a master swordsman. He had also dabbled in the secrets of wizards and elementalists, and even the secrets of witches. From astronomy and geography to the rumors of nobles, there seemed to be nothing he could not bring to the table. In private, Brando was even an alchemist, a blacksmith and a scholar. But even so, they still did not imagine that this count had such a side to him. This was not something that could be explained by being knowledgeable. At least in the eyes of others, this count acted like a seasoned mercenary or adventurer. This was especially so in Scarlet's opinion. She had only seen this aura from mercenaries who had traveled all over Erewhon and even Cruz. She could not help but stop and stare at her count in a daze. But the consequence of this was that the dejected little prince bumped into the package of the azure lance on her back and could not help but groan. Haru's painful groan seemed to break the silence. Brando coughed, as if only now realizing that his performance was a little too much. He could not help but glare at Philas angrily. If it were not for this guy who spoke without thinking, he would not have subconsciously shown his previous side in the game. But he sighed slightly in his heart. In fact, he knew that it was not all the other party's fault. He could not help but glance at the scenery outside through the window of the inn. The scenery here was a little too familiar to him. "As you know, I had an experience of studying abroad in my early years," he smiled awkwardly and replied. "During that time I had dealings with adventurers and mercenaries and also went out to sea." "I see." Philas suddenly realized, "Count, you really had a bit of Lady Veronica's demeanor just now. As far as I know, the Legion commander's early experience was similar to yours. I heard that she had joined a mercenary group alone." The young knight from Cruz seemed to believe Brando's explanation without thinking at all, but that did not mean that everyone was as simple-minded as him. Brando more or less saw a trace of doubt in the other people's eyes. He knew in his heart that his explanation might not be able to convince everyone. The first obvious doubt was that he was too young. But now was obviously not the time to talk about this, and Brando could only brace himself and arrange for everyone to sit down. Fortunately, except for Lorena, Scarlet, Medicia, and Freya, all had a blind trust in him. Seeing that Brando did not say much, they did not want to ask more and took their seats in turn. But it was at this moment, when he thought he had successfully escaped the disaster, a cold voice interrupted. "Brando, you said you went out to sea?" Brando froze slightly. He looked up and saw the last female knight who sat down next to the little prince, Haruz. She seemed to be from the north, with a more common nose bridge, taller and straighter than a southerner with mountain ancestry. Her lips were a little thick, but it did not ruin the delicate beauty of her facial features. Instead, it showed a hint of sexiness. But this sexiness did not make Maynard appear charming. On the contrary, she looked at him calmly with her slightly purple eyes, like a she-wolf staring at her prey. She placed one hand on the sword and swept the black hair on her forehead behind her back. Brando also stared at her. This woman was the only uninvited guest in his team this time. At first, he thought that the princess was worried about the little prince and had ordered her to accompany and protect him. But he had tentatively asked Haruz to take on the more dangerous guard work in the convoy, and the other party did not seem to stop him. This made him very suspicious. Not to mention, with the princess's character, since she had expressed her complete trust in him, she would not be so indecisive. In fact, after a few days of probing, Brando was almost certain that the female knight seemed to be coming for him. But what exactly her goal was, he couldn't say for the time being. But just as Maynard opened her mouth, Brando seemed to hear his heart skip a beat. "Here it comes," he thought to himself, then hesitated for a moment before replying, "What?" "I just want to ask where you came from?" Maynard replied quietly. Her tone seemed to have softened again. This made Brando slightly startled, because he did not hear the tit-for-tat in her tone. On the contrary, because of that familiar face, there was a touch of kindness. "What's the point of asking this?" "No." The female knight shook her head. "I'm just interested. Brando, can you answer me?" Brando suddenly felt very awkward. He did not know why Maynard suddenly did not call him Mr. Brando like the princess did, but called him by his name. This seemed to have suddenly shortened the distance between them, made him feel as if he was being stared at. But he looked at the serious expression on her face, and he really did not know where to start. Could he say no to his senior sister? Brando first shook his head in his heart. Obviously he could not. At this moment he suddenly realized where his uneasiness came from. At this moment, Maynard was too similar to the impression he had in his heart. "I used to study in the Karsuk Plateau under a Black Tower wizard, and I also had the identity of an apprentice. Later, I went out to sea with some people from today's Sebans to Saint Tassel and some places further east." He hesitated for a moment and carefully made up a story. Fortunately, he had rich experience. Even if it was a lie, he felt that there would be no problem. And in the other side of history, he had indeed been to these places. Even if she asked, he was confident that he could handle it. But he did not expect that the female knight just looked at him with a strange and regretful expression. She sighed and said, "I see. I thought you had been to the Shining Sea. Set off from Port Gris by ship, and a few days later, you can see the Kalanga mountain range piercing through the clouds shining on the surface of the sea. That kind of scene must be very beautiful." Hearing this sentence, Brando's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, it was as if he was frozen in place. At that moment, it was as if he could no longer hear anything. There was only one sentence echoing in his head: "Set off from Port Gris by boat, and in a few days, you will be able to see the Kalanga mountains that pierced through the clouds and sparkled on the surface of the sea. That kind of scene must be very beautiful, right?" "Yes, beautiful, majestic, and breathtaking. P.S. I'm not stuck today. I can't afford to play. Chidian is inhumane. It forced me to become a baboon who writes 20,000 chapters a day. Baboon the baboon, begging for monthly votes, begging for cute service in the book review section. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 704. The others around them seemed to have noticed the abnormality between the two and stopped to look at them. Maynard felt Brando's gaze and replied quietly, "I've heard people talk about the beauty of the Shining Sea." "You've heard people talk about?" "Yeah." Maynard nodded. She seemed to have no intention of speaking again. She took off her cloak and hung it on the back of the chair, then turned around and sat upright in the manner of a knight. Brando looked at her and stopped asking, but he knew that it was impossible. He had seen such a scene before. The blue waves were vast, the sun shone on the surface of the sea, The white and brown peaks of the Kalanga Mountains pierced the clouds where the sea and the sky intersected. But the memory at that time was like an old photo that had faded and turned yellow. He still vaguely remembered the faces in the photo, one of which was gradually coming to life, overlapping with the face of the female knight in front of him, as if it had been given color again. Brendel frowned slightly. His mind was in a mess. The trivial details from a few years ago, a few months ago, and even a few days ago were intertwined together to form some plausible but false thoughts. A thought that made him shudder slightly came to mind. Senior Allium Japonicum, could it really be her? Did she recognize him? Or did she just recognize the player's identity? This should be a test? Brando's fingers trembled a little nervously, his fingertips touching the smooth edge of the wooden plate. He felt his throat dry and his heart pounding. The round table also quieted down, leaving only the whispers of Lorena and Philas. Brando quietly looked in the direction of Maynard, feeling a sense of loss. This feeling was somewhat specious. It seemed like it, but it also didn't seem like it. Was this female knight really a senior? He hoped so because there was a familiar feeling about her, but this feeling was also a little unfamiliar. Besides, Brando knew very well that if she was really a senior Allium Japonicum, she would definitely be more powerful than she was now. In the game, his senior sister had played for a shorter time than him, but her achievements were far greater than his. Senpai's experience was rich. She definitely wouldn't become a silent bystander after transmigrating. If she was the one beside Her Royal Highness, he wouldn't need to deal with a wreck in Cypher. But what was going on right now? Brando was all too familiar with the glittering Kalanga Mountains. That was the first time they went out to sea, and everyone was shocked by the magnificent scenery of the sea of flickering light. It was so intimate, and it was deeply imprinted in the depths of their memories. It was impossible to forget. That was like the beginning of a story. Because of that day, there were the days of hot-bloodedness that followed. Everything was for the sake of Erwin, who had left them with memories. He looked at Maynard in a daze, but the female knight was calm. Jia. Brando opened his mouth and uttered a short syllable. The abrupt syllable was like a broken string in the quiet environment, piercing the short silence and making everyone stop to look at them. Lorena and Philas also stopped talking in a low voice and turned back subconsciously. But Brando didn't care about the gazes of others. He just needed an answer. He stared at the female knight with shoulder-length black hair and a calm expression. Maynard's slender fingers trembled slightly. Senpai? It was just a subtle movement. But Brando felt as if a dagger had been stabbed in his heart, causing all the blood vessels in his body to contract. At that moment he felt a tingling sensation like he was suffocating, and then the blood flowed back, giving him a short period of tinnitus. 2 lifetimes had passed, and he never thought he would meet the person who changed him the most, who made him understand what companionship, passion, and love were from his indifferent, selfish personality. He stared into Maynard's purple eyes, waiting for an answer. But Maynard looked up and glanced at him calmly, with some doubt in her eyes. There was a deathly silence. It took at least 10 seconds for Philas to break the silence in confusion. He asked curiously, "G. Alfalfa Festival? What does that mean, Your Grace? Erwin dialect?" The bright light burning in Brando's eyes faded in an instant. "No," he replied somewhat bitterly. He took a light breath, turned back, and managed to squeeze out a smile. Kashuj, a city in the kingdom of Rubik. I mean, you can see the same beautiful scenery there after leaving the Shining Sea. Really? Philas looked interested. The kingdom of Rubik, I've heard of that place. It's a silver desert, and you can see crescent-shaped sand dunes from the sea, one connected to another. There are also mountains there that go straight into the clouds? Where there's land, there are mountains. You can see them a little further south. Brando replied dryly. He suddenly felt something keenly and turned back. Maynard looked at him with some surprise. The two's eyes met for only a moment, but the female knight quickly turned back and no longer paid attention to this side. Brando was slightly taken aback and had some doubts in his heart. While dealing with Philas' exuberant curiosity, he watched Maynard suspiciously, but unfortunately, the latter did not turn back from beginning to end. It was as if everything before was just an illusion. Brando felt a little melancholy in his heart and could not help but feel depressed. The past was indeed the past, and the rest was just his wishful thinking. The clever Lorena and Medisha were keenly aware of the change, and the two immediately diverted the conversation at the table to other aspects. They each thought that Brando was so familiar with this place that perhaps he had such an unforgettable memory here. After all, everyone had their own secrets. The two wise ladies tacitly kept silent. During this time, only Freya saw that something was wrong with Brando and clumsily expressed concern, but the latter perfunctorily brushed it off. The mercenary girl leaning against the azure lance sat in a corner and saw this scene, but she just watched silently as usual. Only Philas was carefree and chatted with Brando here and there. The son of Prince Cruz seemed to regard Brando as his best friend after Brando gave him the right to be the first to come into contact with the prey. The Shire smiled and said nothing about this, only cleverly diverting the topic when Brando felt a little annoyed by this guy. Lorena looked at this scene with some hand on her forehead. Her fiancé was really stupid. The magic hourglass in the center of the inn's lobby had gone through about a third of the journey. After a dreary hour, when the sun was above the lake and cast its shade through the window on the maple-nailed floor, Zhang Lixing said, "Oh, I see." Lunch, nearly 4 hours late, was finally served. Overcooked venison, crumpled bread, salted salmon that was as black as smoked meat, fish soup stirred with red beans, and the only thing that caught one's eye was potato soup. Although Brando knew that there couldn't be anything good in this little-known inn, he couldn't help but frown when he saw the food on the wooden plate that seemed to have long passed its sell-by date. How long had it been since he had last eaten food like this since he left his hunting career in the Amber Sword? He looked up at the sweaty bald boss. Fortunately, the other party wasn't completely useless. In addition to fruit wine and goat's milk, he actually got a jar of honey. Honey was not common in this era and was a luxury item on the dining table of nobles. In addition, Brando knew that there were no beekeepers in the area of Shallow Water Town, so Brando guessed that this jar of honey was probably wild honey from a hunter's home. The boss nodded and bowed as he looked at Brando. Such a respectful attitude was not only because of his identity. Brando knew very well what the other party was trying to do, and it was understandable. Of course, he was also a man of his word. He put away his messy thoughts and gestured to the silver fairy princess beside him. Medisha immediately took out her money pouch and let Brando grab a handful of gold coins from it. Brando looked up and stared at the bald boss. Then he threw the gold coins in front of him. It wasn't that he wanted to show off, but Brando knew that the most effective way to intimidate these unscrupulous people was to act like a noble. The glistening gold coins shone brighter on the boss's forehead. He was indeed stunned by Brando's gesture. It wasn't that he had never seen so much money before, but he had never seen a customer as generous as Brando in his life. Thousands of tolls was almost half a month's worth of income. "I'm a man of my word. As long as you fulfill my orders, I won't be stingy," Brando replied calmly. "This time we're here to hunt a special batch of prey. Do you have any news about the hunters in town?" Yes. The bald boss became even more respectful. In his eyes, Brando had already been promoted to a great noble from Ampere Seal and Kirkle. He was afraid that he would offend the big shot in front of him, so he quickly replied respectfully, "Of course, my lord. Shallow Water Town is only so big. There's no one in town that I don't know. Of course, outsiders are excluded." "You mean that you know there are outsiders in town?" The boss didn't dare to raise his head. "More or less, my lord. I dare not say all of them, but it's not a problem to say most of them. Caravans and adventurers will definitely look for a place to rest when they enter town. In a place like an inn, information flows quickly. It's hard to hide any secrets, my lord." He didn't need to say anything. In fact, Brando knew about it too. However, he was deliberately trying to get information out of the boss. Words spoken unconsciously were often the most trustworthy. "Since you know the situation around here so well, why don't you tell me about our hunt during this time of year?" "My lord, you've chosen the right time. After the middle of the month of flowing fire, the forest in the north will warm up a little. After that, it will quickly enter winter 2 months later. If you want to hunt, you only have this window of 2 months, my lord," the boss said with a look that said he didn't hide anything from Brendel. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 705. This was also what Brando knew. What about the others? Will they trouble us? I don't trust those mercenaries out there. My lord, you can rest assured that there are very few people heading north to the forest. Most of the mercenaries who pass by here are actually going to Lantern Island. Brando nodded. At least the fellow had not lied so far. He narrowed his eyes and asked again, "What about the merchants? Shouldn't there be fur traders going into the forest to collect goods from the hunters at this time of the year? Won't they send mercenaries in?" My lord knows so much. The innkeeper's bald head had a few fine beads of sweat, but there are still very few people at this time of the year, so it's nothing to worry about. Besides, most of them are dutiful merchants. Dutiful merchants. If there were any dutiful merchants left, Brando guessed that it was only the Roman lady beside him. Most of the people walking in Erewhon were armed merchants, and these merchants were more or less dirty. But he didn't mention it and just replied, "I know, but I don't want to listen to your estimates. Just tell me which caravans have entered the forest recently and how I can avoid them." He paused for a moment. "Also, get me a record of the merchant ships that have entered and left the port recently. I know that there will be records of this in your inn." "Understood." The innkeeper wiped the grease off his bald head and replied with a head full of sweat, "I understand, my lord. I'll get it for you right away." Brando had apparently succeeded in convincing the Baldi that they were a group of extravagant aristocrats who had come out to hunt rare prey, the white stag. With such an understanding, it was natural that everything went smoothly. In less than half an hour, he had asked about most of the things that had happened in Shallow Water Town and the surrounding areas in the recent period. These matters ranged from trivial matters such as neighborhood conflicts, to which ships had recently left the port. Everything, no matter how big or small, was made clear to him. It had to be said that the inn was indeed a crowded place for information gathering and dispersing. Firas and Lorena could not help but widen their eyes when they heard what the plain-looking Baldi knew. However, Brando was a little amused. In his opinion, some rumors could only fool rookies like him who were out for the first time. He flipped through the greasy book he took from the innkeeper and threw it aside. In this era, Erewhon's literacy rate was still not high. Most of the innkeepers had their own set of markings to record important matters. However, this was not a problem for Brando. Fanzin, Saint Tassel, and Cruz may not be familiar with the shorthand of remote places, but when it came to Erewhon, he was all too familiar with it. Under the admiring gaze of the innkeeper, he easily finished reading the records in the book, then took the map out of his backpack and rolled it out on the table. He actually did not care about which ships were entering or leaving the port. Besides, even if a wreck was on one of them, he would not be able to tell. It was just a smokescreen. What he really cared about was the caravans leaving Shallow Water Town, and the news of the recent sightings of the beast. Is what that guy said true? Firas seemed to have just recovered from the shock. He said someone saw a cat turn into a fish. Is that possible? Brando had to look away from the map. He used a quill pen to mark the area where the beasts had been sighting recently. Then he turned back and looked at the guy like he was an idiot. Of course not. There is a lot of news circulating in places like the inn, but most of it is rumors. If you want to find useful information from it, you have to use your brain. So that's how it is. I didn't expect there to be such knowledge. Firas showed a look of sudden realization. But his fiancée, Lorena, obviously understood more. She chewed on this sentence and looked up to ask, "So which piece of information do we need, Count?" Brando had to sigh inwardly when he heard this. It was like a flower stuck in cow dung. As expected of the genius girl of Cruz, her reaction was much faster than the average person's. He put the map aside and flipped the grilled fish on his plate with a wooden fork. It's unlikely that the prey we're after would leave his tracks openly, but he would still leave some clues behind. The innkeeper said that some hunters had entered the mountain ahead of time. "My lord, do you suspect that they were hired by Erek as guides?" The Silver Fairy Princess put down her knife and fork when she heard this and looked up to ask softly. "It's just a suspicion now," Brando replied. "As for whether it's true or not, we'll have to wait and see." He tore off a piece of meat from the so-called salt-baked salmon with a fork. The tenacity of the meat made him feel like he was cutting a piece of dragon skin. When he put it in his mouth, the strong fishy taste made him frown and almost spit it out. After getting used to fine food in his territory, he couldn't stand the crude cooking methods of the outside world. However, he still chewed it like a piece of rock and swallowed it. Traveling outside meant having to adapt to harsh conditions. Without food there would be no strength, and Brando understood that. But he still had to sigh. It was easy to go from frugal to extravagant, but difficult to go from extravagant to frugal. When he started in the game, he also ate these trash-like things. He swallowed them like healing potions and there was nothing wrong with it. But now he couldn't stand it. This was the so-called difference in mentality. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but look up at the others. Scarlet and Freya, who came from the countryside and lived a simple life, didn't seem to feel anything wrong with such food. The food they ate in the countryside of Chablis and Butchie might not be better than this. Especially for Scarlet, it was not easy to eat a hot meal in the wild, and usually only black bread that was as hard as a rock could fill her stomach. But Lorena and Filas couldn't. Although their table manners were impeccable, the couple only tried the roast venison and put down their knives and forks. Medisha, on the other hand, was more elegant. The silver fairy princess ate a little bit of each dish as a sign of respect for her master. But each time she ate a little less than the previous time. Then she put down her knife and fork gracefully. Of course, as a heroic spirit, she didn't need to eat. The Shire sat in an inelegant posture, leaning on his staff. It was just an ordinary maple staff, and he wisely only drank a few mouthfuls of fruit wine. Beside him, Hippamera was still praying with her hands clasped together, and the little prince stared at the roast meat and goat's milk in front of him with a bitter face, looking like he was about to cry. Only Maynard's performance impressed Brando. The knight followed the usual dining tradition and used a knife to separate the red beans from the fish soup, and then put the hard-to-swallow food into her mouth one by one. She finished it all with a straight face and didn't waste a single bit. The whole process was so standard that it was like a precise machine, and Brando couldn't help but look at it a few more times. Finally, she wiped her mouth with a white handkerchief, put down her knife and fork, and nodded to the waiter on the side to express her gratitude. Brendel's tears almost fell from his eyes. While everyone was still struggling with this horrible lunch, a crisp voice interrupted them. "You're right. You're right. You're right. You're right." At that time, Brando was studying a map of the northern end of the Ansara forest published in 357 by the Royal Geographical Society of Erewhon. But when he heard the young voice, he couldn't help but look away from the map and look behind him. He saw a little girl. She had long purple hair, a slender face and big amethyst-like eyes. She gave off the feeling of a doll. She was wearing a gorgeous dress, although it was a little old, but she didn't look like a commoner's child. Especially the jewels on the pair of round-toed leather shoes, Brando could tell at a glance that they were authentic. She stood there like a fairy in a fairy tale, and people couldn't take their eyes off her. The little girl wrung her hands and asked politely, "Can I sit here for a while?" She pointed to the empty seat next to Haruz. As soon as Lorena saw the little girl, she couldn't help but feel overflowing with love. But the master here was still Brando, so she could only worry there. Fortunately, Freya seemed to sense her thoughts and she asked in a soft tone, "Are you lost, little girl? Would you like something to eat?" "No, thank you," the little girl replied generously. "I'm waiting for someone here, but I'm a little scared to be alone. Can I sit with you?" Freya turned her gaze to Brando. Brando looked at the little prince in front of him with some amusement. It turned out that he saw Haruz staring at the little girl from the moment she appeared, and his eyes almost popped out. "Haruz, this little lady wants to sit next to you, do you agree?" When Brando said this, he had already carefully examined the little girl and had already noticed that there was no aura of power on the other party, and that she was just an ordinary person. The little prince didn't seem to hear him, and it wasn't until Brando called him twice that he reacted. He let out an "ah" and his face turned red. Of course. Thank you." The little girl bowed to everyone immaturely, and Brando knew at once that she was a descendant of a noble and not just any noble. He glanced at Maynard, and the female knight seemed to be sizing up the little girl as well, but like him, she didn't say anything. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 706. Of course, Haruz stammered. "Thank you, little brother." The little girl thanked him again, then lifted her skirt and sat down next to the future king of Erewhon. However, Haruz obviously didn't have the self-awareness of being a crown prince. His face was as red as a ripe apple, and he looked helpless as if he wanted to get closer to the little girl, but was afraid of touching her and causing her displeasure. Brando couldn't help but shake his head when he saw this scene. The little prince's behavior was not even comparable to that of an ordinary noble's, let alone a member of the royal family. He really didn't know how Oberway and his sister taught him. However, he thought of an interesting question. If Haruz really liked this little girl, then what would happen to Eek and Yura's daughter, Alara, in the future? Would this be a change in history? Thinking of this, he couldn't help but narrow his eyes and stare at the little girl. To be honest, he also admired this little girl. In Erewhon's era, most of the daughters of the common people couldn't be as graceful as her, and most of the children of the noble families were domineering and had long forgotten the etiquette of the sages. In Brando's mind, Vahina was a typical example. But fortunately, the girl's nature wasn't bad and she didn't give him too much trouble. But the other one? He couldn't help but have a headache when he thought of the Prime Minister's daughter. But just as he was thinking about it, he suddenly heard Lorena ask with some concern, "Little girl, what's your name?" The little girl looked up at the female knight and replied in a childish voice, "Originally, Mommy said that names shouldn't be told to strangers. But I know you're a good person, sister, so I can tell you in secret." Then she leaned over and whispered in Lorena's ear, Big sister, my name is Micaiah. But although this sentence was whispered, at least half of the people present heard it clearly. Except for the little prince and the greatly weakened the Shire, Medisha and Hippamera, Brando, Freya, Scarlet, Maynard, and Faraz all heard it clearly. After all, as beings with strength above silver, it was very easy for their senses to hear a little girl's unintentional whispers at such a close distance. But the mountain girl and Freya naturally wouldn't say it out loud, and Faraz's mind wasn't on it at all. In fact, he had been staring at the jar of honey next to Brando with drooling desire. Of the four, only Brando raised his eyebrows slightly. Micaiah, the name. It sounded familiar. He immediately became alert. Now, he was very sensitive to this kind of feeling. In the past, there were too many records of background, history, and information in the game. Not everyone could be omniscient, but most of the names and events that were well known would more or less leave a mark in the hearts of the players. The deeper such a mark was, the more important the event was. And the War of the Black Roses, an unforgettable event for Brando, would never be forgotten for the rest of his life. A name that he was familiar with but couldn't remember meant that there were two possibilities. One possibility was that the meaning of the name itself wasn't very outstanding, but it occupied a place in history. The other possibility was that the owner of the name might be very famous, but had little interaction with him. The former was the replacement of some small local lords, and the latter was the owner of a secondary seat in the Council of 12 of Buga. Although the Council of 12 of the Silver Folk was a terrifying existence, Brando really couldn't remember the full names of the others except for the two names William and Tumen. Of course, he might be able to remember the other person's identity when he saw the name, but it wasn't so easy to remember every detail. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but straighten up a little seriously. And at the same time, he saw the female knight Maynard opposite him also cast a somewhat serious look at the little girl. But the little girl was sharper than he thought. She seemed to notice Brando's abnormality and looked up at him with some fear. "Uncle, what's wrong?" "Uncle?" Brando almost spat out a mouthful of blood. Even if he counted his birthday next month, he was only 21 years old. 21 years old. How did he become an uncle? He took a deep breath and calmed himself down with great difficulty. He thought to himself, forget it. Anyway, with the age of his other soul, being called uncle wasn't a big deal. He paused for a moment and asked in what he thought was the most gentle voice, "Little girl, you said your name is Micaiah? What's your full name?" Brando dared to guarantee that his expression at that moment must be the most gentle, and would never be mistaken for a strange uncle who used lollipops to kidnap a Lolita, but he immediately discovered that it was just his illusion. Micaiah looked at him with some fear, suddenly slid down from the chair and carefully replied, "My name is Micaiah, uncle. My mom and dad are coming soon, I'll go first, thank you." Then she bowed to everyone and ran outside. Wait. Brando was slightly startled and was about to reach out to stop the little girl. But it was at this time that he saw a man running in from outside the door of the inn. As soon as the man entered the inn he shouted, "Found it, sir." Only then did Brando notice that the man was bald. This was the innkeeper who had been sent out to help him inquire about the news. Seeing this guy, Brando swallowed the words that were in his throat back into his stomach. He glanced at the little girl called Micaiah from afar, and the latter had run to the counter in a short while. Forget it, Brando couldn't help but sigh. Anyway, there would be plenty of opportunities in the future, and his most important task was obviously not to investigate the identity of a little girl. On the contrary, the most important thing for him now was the news that the bald innkeeper had brought back. He didn't know if he had found any useful information. He looked in that direction, and the bald innkeeper had already run to their side, panting. He looked at Brando with an extremely admiring look and replied while panting, "Sir, you really have godlike foresight, just tell me the result." Brando threw a gold coin over, well aware of this guy's trick. "I went to ask, those hunters did go directly into the forest without any preparation, which is strange, I haven't heard of anyone who dared to be so bold in so many years." The innkeeper smiled good-naturedly as he put away the gold coin and replied naggingly, "They didn't prepare any tools, they didn't even bring any supplies, they must have lost their minds." "They're not crazy," Lorena's voice cut in, interrupting him. "It's because someone prepared supplies for them." Oh. The innkeeper was stunned. Except for him, everyone sitting there looked at each other with a look of understanding, even Faraz, who had been slow to react. Who would prepare supplies for those hunters? Naturally, it could only be that cunning fox Arek. Because there had been almost no record of caravans entering or leaving the country recently. So Brando was almost certain that Arek had not entered Shallow Water Town at all, but they still needed a local guide. After all, not everyone was as familiar with the forest as he was. So he could infer that Erek must have bypassed Shallow Water Town, just sent someone to hire some local hunters, and then went straight into the forest. As long as he had this clue, then the following tracking would be much easier. Brando's eyes calmed down, he put down the map and asked, "When did those hunters enter the forest?" "A week ago, my lord." The innkeeper took the money and naturally did his best, answering without hesitation. "A week." Brando pondered for a moment. This was not a long time, and it was very likely that Erek had not yet crossed the northern part of the Ansara forest. But there was no time to lose, they had to get moving right away. Of course, before that he had to grasp more advantages. He looked up, and the female knight Lorena and her fiancé Faraz looked at the lord with some admiration. Although filtering useful information from useless rumors was actually just the most basic compulsory course for most veteran adventurers and mercenaries, but in the eyes of these newbies, who had just left home for the first time, Brando suddenly rose to the height of wisdom. At this time, Brando was pulling out a roll of parchment from under his cloak and throwing it in front of the innkeeper. "You read this?" "Me?" The innkeeper was slightly taken aback by Brando's sudden action. In his previous impression, although the noble young man was very capable, he was not too different from those playboys. But it seemed that all of a sudden, the noble in front of him had changed, the feeling was like an unsheathed sword becoming fierce. Brando pointed at the parchment and nodded to him. The innkeeper then picked up the parchment with trepidation, and then slowly opened it. But he had just finished reading the first row when he almost threw it out with a shudder. Royal Knight Regiment. "My lord, you are a Royal Knight?" The innkeeper's face was pale, and he could not help but stutter a little, wiping the oily sweat from his head as he asked. Brando nodded. This was one of the identities that Princess Griffine had entrusted to him. In fact, after the Battle of Ampere Seal, because of the support of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, the princess's forces could almost be considered as the orthodox forces of Erewhon. In addition to the northern nobles, Erek, who had colluded with All for One, had long been declared a criminal by the Holy Cathedral and was wanted by the Holy Cathedral. So now it could be said that the difference in status between him and the Duke was completely different from when he first stole Grodin's title from Tanajil. His real identity used to be a bandit, a rebel and a bandit, but now Erek was a heretic wanted by the Holy Cathedral of Fire. In that case, of course, he would take advantage of this apparent change in status. Brando pushed the parchment in front of the innkeeper and said sternly, "So now you know who we are?" My lord." The bald innkeeper replied with sweat dripping down his forehead. "Don't worry, we are not here to cause trouble for you." Brando was speechless as he looked at the man who was scared out of his wits. He had to say something to comfort him. "But I can tell you clearly now that the people who entered the forest are a group of vicious heretics." "My lord, you mean those hunters are heretics?" The innkeeper did not know where the courage came from, but he actually interrupted Brando in surprise. Brando was speechless for a moment. "No, I mean the people who hired them to enter the forest." "Oh no." Hearing this sentence, the innkeeper suddenly jumped up as if the soles of his feet were on fire. "So the hunters who entered the forest are not in danger?" Brando sighed in relief. He did not expect this greedy and unscrupulous man to be worried about others. He could not help but show a slight admiration. He nodded and said, "Yes, so quickly go and find the families of those hunters, their wives, daughters, parents, and those who are familiar with them. They must know the path that those hunters are used to taking into the forest at this time of year." He paused for a moment and continued, "We must catch up with those heretics before they do. You understand?" The bald innkeeper was slightly startled, and immediately nodded and patted his chest to assure Brando that he would immediately find those relevant people. Brando was too lazy to pay attention to this guy. After sending him away with great difficulty, he turned around and saw Freya asking worriedly, "Are those hunters really in danger, Brando?" "There is definitely danger, but it's not a big problem for the time being." Brando thought for a moment and replied, "At least before leaving the stained frost forest, Erek will definitely not do anything to them." "My lord Count, so you said that just to make him hurry up?" Lorena asked with some confusion, "But won't this make the families of those hunters worry for nothing?" Brando shook his head. "If we can catch up with Erek, naturally the sooner the better. I'm afraid that guy will be too careful and waste unnecessary time. Besides, it's better to worry than to actually die." "I see, you're right." The female knight nodded. Brando turned his head and watched the innkeeper crawl out of the door, his bald head very conspicuous on the street. He took a light breath and looked down at the map spread out on the table. His gaze subconsciously moved to the Lantan Island area, but suddenly he saw a familiar place name, Arucher. Arucher Micaiah? At that moment, a bright electric light flashed through Brando's mind. He couldn't help but scream in his heart, F***C Arucher Micaiah? That little girl is the future witch queen. P.S. 10,000 strong baboons are here again. This should be the 13th day. What are you still hesitating for? Where are the votes? To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for recommendation and monthly votes. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 707. Before evening, Brando had obtained a map of the hidden routes the hunters used to enter the forest. This was all thanks to the bald boss of the coach house's propaganda. Or rather, intimidation. The secret paths in the forest were only known to the hunters, and every single one of them was a secret passed down from generation to generation. If not for the safety of their own families, they would never hand them over to outsiders. Of course, Brando's identity as a royal knight also played a huge role. The commoners always subconsciously knew that a noble did not need their secrets. On the contrary, when they heard that a knight from the royal family was going to rescue their loved ones, they could not help but feel grateful. Some even volunteered to be Brando's guide, but Brando politely rejected them. It was not that he thought he was more familiar with the forest in the north than the locals, but it was not worth it to bring a burden along for this little bit of convenience. Soon it was close to dusk. The red sun was slanting into the mountains on the west coast of Lake Valendon. The setting sun dyed the entire world in a hazy golden red. Under the twilight, a caravan consisting of only a single carriage was leaving Shallow Water Town's northern gate. Brando rode his warhorse at the front of the convoy, moving along the crescent-shaped beach by the lake. His shadow was dragged long by the setting sun, as if he was a silhouette of the gloomy Northansora forest ahead. Brando raised his head and looked at the forest buried in the shadows of the mountains. The dark canopy of the trees was like countless nails arranged together, stretching all the way to the gray background of the Goldfinch Mountains. It was a vast cedar forest. A series of hooves sounded behind him. Brando turned his head to the side and saw a bright purple. The Shire's long robe fluttered slightly in the evening wind. He was riding a chestnut-colored warhorse, catching up from behind. Compared to the other wizards, the Highland wizards had some experience as knights' apprentices, so they more or less knew some riding skills. This young wizard was undoubtedly one of the best. "Hey, Sir Overlord." The Shire's snow-white hand held the reins while his other hand held his cane. He made a special greeting. "I just got something interesting. You must want to see it." Brando was too lazy to look at this grinning guy. In his vision, the sunset glow in the eastern sky faded slightly and was replaced by a transparent light blue. A few white stars dotted the blue night sky, faintly discernible. A cool breeze blew across the surface of the lake, and the floating golden light rippled on the waves, like a few light ribbons. Bathing in the evening breeze, he snorted softly. "What is it?" He was very clear about the temperament of this guy who had followed him for a long time. If he showed too much interest, this guy might become complacent and keep him in suspense. The Shire laughed dryly. Then the bill for the hotel? Brando thought that Baldy had secretly tampered with the bill again. He couldn't help but sigh. It was one thing to tamper with the bill, but to be caught red-handed, this was really disappointing. "He's just a profiteer. There's no need to bother with him." No. The Shire shook his head. "I don't think he's that stupid. Did any of us replenish our supplies at the hotel?" Brando was slightly startled. "Replenish our supplies? Of course not, but you can ask Mr. and Mrs. Lorena. Maybe they bought something." "I've already asked." "They don't know either, Sir Overlord." Brando turned around with a suspicious look in his eyes. The convoy had made the last replenishment at Fort Kirkle. After that, there was no need to replenish their supplies at all. He became alert. "What's going on?" "I've asked the waiter." The Shire, "Get to the point. If you keep me in suspense, I'll kick you into the lake." Brando replied impatiently. Okay. The Shire quickly raised his hands in surrender. "Sir Overlord, the waiter said so. The little girl who was with us asked him to buy these things. And then he blamed it on us." Brando was slightly puzzled. "Does he think we're in cahoots with the little girl?" "Yes, we're in cahoots. But that's what the little girl said herself, if the waiter wasn't lying." The Shire spread his hands on the horse's back. "Wait." Brando suddenly reacted. "You said she left the bill to us?" "I'm afraid so, Sir Overlord." The Shire laughed. "She successfully conspired to take over Grodden's position and forced the legitimate nobles to acknowledge him. Count Trentheim, who had never suffered a loss, who had protected all his confidence and hope, who had saved the loop of trade winds, who had gone to Ampere Cypher alone to defeat Duke Cypher and the Holy Cathedral of Fire, who had never thought that he would be defeated by a little girl today. No one would believe this. Brando raised his head and straightened his body. He faced the direction of the forest and urged his horse to run faster. He squinted his eyes in the wind and replied, "You're right. This is really bad." The Shire saw his overlord's smug expression and was slightly startled. Naturally, he could not catch up with Brando and could only shout from behind, "My lord, why do I feel like you've succeeded in your scheme?" Brendel smiled faintly but did not reply. He was not just in a good mood, he was in a very good mood. Micaiah Every Eye was a famous name in history. The Witch of Arucher, the Rebel, the Witch of Gold, the Merchant of Equality and Sophistry. But the most famous of them all was, she was undoubtedly the ruler of the Bunasan, the overlord of the Winter Kingdom, and the Witch Queen. She was the ruler of space and time, the successor of the Witch of Nothingness, Euphorbia. She was known as the most unique witch among the 12 branches of witches. Because she was a witch but also pursued the path of rebellion to break free from the witch's fate, she was once called a rebel by the witches. But it was such a rebel who finally gained the recognition of the Crown of Winter and became the first witch queen to unify the 12 branches of witches after 1,000 years. Micaiah was from Erewhon, but before the Third War of the Black Roses she left Erewhon with her teacher and went to cruise. Before that, the Witch Queen had been living in Arucher, Lantan Island, so she was also known as the Witch of Arucher. After that, Micaiah experienced nearly 30 years of wandering life. When she became the Witch Queen, Erewhon was long gone. Therefore, Brando did not have much interaction with the Witch Queen. Her name was like one of the many stars floating in the bright starry sky of Wonde. Although brilliant, it was only a wave in the long river of history. But now the significance was slightly different. Micaiah was still a little girl, but her talent could not be doubted. Brando now doubted whether the parents she spoke of really existed, because she looked more like an orphan. Although it was a little rude to think so, it was really good news for Brando. Compared to persuading a noble couple to give their child to him to teach, it was much easier to lure an isolated and helpless little girl with a stable and good environment. From Micaiah's behavior, it could be seen that she must have no food or clothing, maybe she was separated from her parents. But Brando did not turn his horse around, because he remembered that Micaiah would officially become a witch around March next year. Before that, he still had a lot of time. In any case, he had already asked the owner of the carriage house to keep an eye out for him. Although he did not think that the little girl would continue to stay in Shallow Water Town after committing the crime with her calm and intelligence. But it didn't matter, there was still time. Brando and his horse galloped together in the wind, and he could not help but let out a sigh of relief in his heart. The three heroes of Erewhon, the Valkyrie, Amandina, Bosley, Tamar and Carglaise were all outstanding young people. If the Witch Queen from the other side of history was added, more and more outstanding talents were gathered on this ship sailing out of the storm. Perhaps the history of the Erewhon would really change because of this. From evening to the dawn of the night, everyone in the caravan saw the young lord's figure galloping wildly under the moonlight. He ran a big circle around the edge of the forest and circled back to the starting point, seeming to be particularly high-spirited. However, very few people knew what the Count was thinking. Only a slightly cold gaze was silently watching the silhouette under the moonlight. Nightfall in summer always came especially late. Although the full moon had already rushed over the gray mountains, the fiery sunset was still unwilling to retract its last ray of light. It was only after 8 o'clock that the forest by the lake was completely dark. If this was the Tanajul region, the forest would already be filled with the sound of insects chirping, but the cedar forest was especially cold. The rustling of the temperature and the frost on the pine trees seemed to be incompatible with the season. But Brando did not slow down the caravan. Instead, he returned to the side of the carriage and urged everyone to maintain the same speed. From here onwards, they would enter the northern Ansara forest and enter the Foy Fork. This place was still far from the Falling Needle Hills. The frost demons that lived in the cedar forest were magical creatures that were over level 20. Even experienced hunters could easily subdue them. Of course, they had to rely on traps and cooperation. But Brando was looking for a more beautiful creature, and the first night in the forest was especially important for him. He tightened the reins and slowed the warhorse down. He bypassed the carriage full of supplies and carefully checked the condition of the shafts and wheels. Traveling on the uneven road in the forest in cold weather was especially taxing on the loaded carriage, so he had to be more careful. Brando had experienced many adventures and naturally had the relevant experience. But when he reached the other end, he saw a familiar face. The female knight was sitting on a pitch-black warhorse, holding the reins with both hands. She looked at him calmly as if she had been waiting for him for a long time. The first night is very important, isn't it? Her voice was calm and cold. After the night fell, the cold wind began to carry a hint of coldness, as if it was sweeping through the forest. Brando shivered. He held the reins with one hand and looked at the female knight. Who are you? That's not important. Let the others set up camp. Maynard tucked her black sandalwood hair behind her ears and glanced at him from the corner of her eyes. Come with me. Bring your 3 attendants. As she spoke, she turned the horse around and left him with a suave view of her back. Wait. Brando was stunned. Idiot, Maynard replied with her back turned. Don't ask so many meaningless questions. Isn't your mission to catch the crystal deer? I know where it is. It was as if a bolt of lightning had descended from the sky and landed on Brando, causing him to freeze completely. P.S. After obtaining Lady Nicole's permission, you baboons are resting today. The main thing is to stabilize the quality and continue to explode with 10,000 copies tomorrow. Also, someone asked me about the update plan for next month around the new year. We'll see when the time comes. I'm going out on the 2nd. If I can rush out the chapters before then, I'll maintain 10,000 new updates. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Jianghu to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 708. As if by some strange coincidence, Brando obeyed Maynard's orders and gave the order to set up camp, but he didn't bring the Shire, Medisha, or Hippamera with him. Instead, he chased Maynard into the Ansara forest alone. The 2 warhorses passed through the forest at night and passed through a gentle hillside. This was the Weiler hillside to the north of Shallow Water Town that Brando was familiar with. But soon, the forest gradually became sparse and open up, and in Brando's field of vision, a silver-like path paved between the woodlands. It was actually the reflection of the moonlight. The silver moon hung high in the sky, depicting the uneven treetops of the cedar trees, and the withered leaves piled up in layers below. The graceful figure of the female knight was always in front of Brando, maintaining a steady pace. She didn't speak, just silently moving forward. But Brando finally couldn't suppress the doubts in his heart. He urged the horse to close the distance between them. What do you want, Madame Maynard? The female knight slowed down and answered without turning her head. Didn't I tell you before? I know where the crystal stag is. Her voice was like a clear spring in the mountains, flowing gently. This wasn't the answer Brando wanted. He wanted another answer. But how do you know? This place was already very close to a valley in his memory called Holy Silver Valley, where many moonlight flowers bloomed. But more importantly, there was an even more beautiful and enchanting creature living there. In the folklore of the Ansara forest, there was a charming crystal stag living in the forest. Every full moon night, it would wander through the forest and devour the moonlight. Only a few people had seen it before, but any hunter who met it by chance would be lucky for the next month. After all, legends were just legends. The crystal stag in the amber sword was an elemental creature from the water elemental plane. A small number of them existed in Wonde, and in Erewhon, they mostly lived in the Ansara forest and the Falling Needle Hills to the south of the Stained Frost forest. Their food was pure magic, so when the moon of magic was full, these enchanting creatures would migrate in the direction of the flow of magic in the forest. This was a level 55 elemental creature with a simple healing element. It was worth mentioning that they weren't as peaceful as the legends said. The crystal stag had a strong sense of territory and would often attack intruders. And they would also move with the frost demons in the forest, so they weren't suitable prey. But there was only one elemental activation mission in the north of Manoir, and that was to obtain the crystallized blood of the crystal stag. The question was, how did she know all this? The female knight turned her head, and the milky moonlight outlined the curve of her face. She looked at him, and there was a bright reflection in her eyes, but she was very calm. I also know that you want crystallized blood. Brando's knuckles turned white as he gripped the reins. Who exactly are you? An equivalent exchange. Before I answer your question, I want to ask you a question. Maynard turned her head and continued to move forward slowly on the horse's back. Her voice was very soft and calm, as if she was narrating something unimportant. Brando was silent for a moment. His mind was a mess and he tried to organize it. But all his questions were focused on one point. He said hesitantly, "Ask away." Some people are racing. At this time, a rider has surpassed the original second place. May I ask what place he is now? Brando didn't expect Maynard to ask such a strange question. Without thinking he answered, "First place?" Maynard giggled. I understand. You're Sophie, right? Brando was like a stone statue on the horse's back. He stared at the female knight in a daze, his teeth chattering. That name seemed to be squeezed out from the depths of his throat. Allium Japonicum, Senior? Maynard stopped and glanced at him. I'm not her. That's impossible. Brando was a little anxious. He almost recognized her. Otherwise, why didn't Maynard exist in history? Why did she look exactly like his senior? Why did she know who he was? But why didn't she admit it? But I know her, Maynard replied faintly. Brando was slightly startled. Maynard's tone was very quiet, as if to calm his restless heart. He looked at the woman, the familiar back, in confusion. What's going on? I don't know. Maynard sighed faintly. But I'm very happy that I guessed right. If you don't feel bored, I can tell you about myself. Please tell me. Brando tried his best to suppress his emotions. He felt that he was going crazy. I've been dreaming since I can remember. Some strange, absurd dreams. Sometimes, in my dreams, I dream that the kingdom is overturned and everything is in a sea of fire. Sometimes, I dream that I've become another person. In such dreams, I'm like a bystander, but I'm still struggling in an obscure fate. In the end, history returns to the same path. Maynard slowly recounted her past. Her voice became a little gloomy. In that history, I know you're senior. Brando seemed to have woken up from a dream. The first thing he said was, that's impossible. Among all her members, you're the dumbest. In all the intellectual questions, you're always wrong. But her favorite member is you. Because you're simple and full of ideals like a blank piece of paper. Maynard replied, I've more or less guessed your identity. But until today I'm sure who you are, Sophie. Brando held the reins tightly and stared at the woman. If you're not her, why are you telling me this? His voice sounded a little like his soul had been sucked out. Because I'm scared. Scared? In my dreams I've seen many strange scenes. I don't know which of them are real and which of them are fake. But it wasn't until this dream began to come true that I began to fear the end. I gave myself a name, Maynard. In the few fragments of my memory about the dream, this word represents revenge. I hope to fight against my fate. Wait. Brando seemed to be listening to an incredible story. He found that he understood the things that Maynard said. They corresponded to everything that happened in the previous world. But just as he was about to speak, the knight interrupted. Don't interrupt. The knight continued, because of this wish, I came to the princess' side. But I found that my idea was wishful thinking. I joined the royal faction, but it was just like what I saw in my dream. Even the royal faction couldn't stop it from happening. Erwin was like a sinking ship caught in a storm. Everyone on the ship could only watch as it was pulled into the center of the whirlpool. At this point she stopped and asked, do you believe what I said? Brando's feelings at this moment were no less than the day he traveled to Bucci. His mind was also a mess. He vaguely felt that there was some kind of connection between the two, but he couldn't figure it out. Hearing the knight's question, he nodded stiffly and said, this is an incredible story, but you believe it, right? Because you personally experienced part of it? Maynard asked quietly. This question made Brando shiver. He stared at her. Because it was an opportunity for me. Maynard did not avoid Brando's gaze. Until one day I found that everything started to deviate from its original path. From which day? Brando had already guessed something, but he still asked in a ghostly tone. His voice was trembling. From the day Grodin died. Brando trembled slightly. The knight seemed to have never spoken so much in her life. She sighed softly and said, do you understand, Mr. Brando? I know that you are the only opportunity to change everything. Only you can prevent Erwin from falling into destruction. Because I know that you and I have experienced the same history. Although I don't know where you came from, maybe you had the same dream as me, but at least I understand your thoughts. She turned around and looked at him with bright eyes. You won't let it happen again, right? Brendel rode silently on his horse and did not answer for a while. Why are you telling me this? After a while he asked the same question as before. Because I want to help you, Maynard answered. Help me? That dream was clear and blurry at the same time. It let me know some trivial things. Although I can't remember when the war between Erwin and Madara broke out, I can't tell who is enemy and who is friend. It's like there's a barrier between me and history. She paused for a moment. But, you know, she knows more than you. I can help you, Brando. Like now? Brando took a deep breath. He knew that Maynard was right. She knew more than he did. Before the year of Lin Mao he was still a complete rookie. Most of the information he had about the era before this came from the records on the forum after that. But before the First War of the Black Roses broke out, she was already a veteran commander. But he did not expect that even in another world she would still stand by his side like before. Brando suddenly felt a stinging sensation at the corner of his eyes. He blinked. "Can you remember everything, Madame Maynold?" "I can't," the knight answered calmly, "but I can at least remember part of it." "That's enough." Brando smiled slightly. He had completely calmed down. He stopped his horse and extended his hand to her. "With Martha as the witness, it's a pleasure to work with you." Maynold stopped as well. This was a common way for players to form parties in the game. She was slightly startled, as if she was in a different world. But she only reached out and touched Brando's finger lightly. "It's a pleasure to work with you, but don't try to take advantage of me, Brando." To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 709. The two of them stood on the cliff, gazing at the silent valley. "We'll reach the Holy Seal Valley if we go down from here. Do you still remember the specific steps to catch the crystal stag?" Brando observed the situation below. The valley was also covered in dense cedar forest, but there were specks of light between the trees. Those were the light of the moonlight grass. "Go down. Catch it." Brando turned his head and gazed at the calm female knight. This was really like the answer from Senior Allium Japonicum. It was simple, clear, and without any ambiguity. "Why are you looking at me? With your current abilities, it's not difficult to catch it. I only remember that this valley is a concentric circle. The frost demons live on the outermost perimeter, and then there's a lake. The lake is very shallow, and many places can be crossed by wading through." Maynold bathed in the night wind with a calm expression. "Even if you obtain this information from the kingdom's geographical records." "You guessed correctly, Mr. Brando. I did obtain this information from the Manowir geographical records published in 355. The memories in my dream are fragmented, and sometimes I have to match them one by one from documents," Maynold answered calmly. "But you told me you can find the crystal stag. They only appear at 3 or 4 o'clock tonight when the moon is full. They travel by the River of Magic, but I've never had the experience of finding the River of Magic." "I have, but you need to bring me down first." Brando let out a sigh of relief. He looked back at the pitch-black forest and nodded. "That's not a problem." The distance from the outskirts of the valley to the central lake was a slope that sloped toward the center. Large patches of cedar forest were spread out sparsely, and the forest was dotted with moonlight grass that glowed brightly. From afar it looked like a meadow on fire. This was also the place where frost demons could be found. Frost demons were a type of secondary elemental creature that looked a bit like a flat ice man. Its strength was about the same as 3 skeleton soldiers, and its vitality was far more tenacious than the latter. However, it didn't have any special means of attack, except for a spell called Frost Flying Dagger. As a low-level magical creature, frost demons also lacked intelligence. Their movements were completely based on their beastly instincts. Therefore the hunters set up traps to catch them. The frost core, the magic core in their bodies, was an inferior magic crystal. It could be sold for a good price in the market. However, Brando did not intend to provoke these things. Most frost demons like to move in groups, especially near their habitat. He did not want to attract the attention of these demonic creatures. This was the first test of this mission. To the average player, this test would be quite troublesome. Brando could imagine that only an expert could complete this quest. Most players would choose to gather their friends and fight their way in from the outside. However, this quest was unusually simple for him. He simply took out King Buni's concealment cloak of all things from his backpack, opened it and stood down. He looked up at the female knight beside him and said, "Come in." Maynold hesitated for a moment before she got into the cloak and squeezed together with Brando. "I'm warning you, don't take the opportunity to get close to me," she exhaled. Brando nodded awkwardly and closed the cloak with his hands. Inevitably, the distance between the two of them got closer. Maynold snorted softly, but she knew that Brando did not mean to take advantage of her, so she could only ignore it. With the concealment cloak of all things, passing through the frost demon's territory became a very simple matter. There was no need to think about taking a detour. Brando went straight through the first half of the valley. Soon he saw a silver light spot appear in the forest. It was a lake. The reason why it was shining was because the mirror-like surface of the lake reflected the continuous flow of moonlight grass. As Brando approached the lake, the concealment cloak in his hands gradually lost its magic power. After 2 flashes, it turned back into an old rag. At this moment, Brando heard a sharp squeak from behind him. He knew it was not good. He hurriedly put away the cloak and pulled out Haurangaya. Looking back, he saw a creature that looked like a transparent ice crystal looking at them under the shadow of a tree not far away. That thing looked like a thin ice man. Its height was only half that of a normal human. He could barely make out that there was a ball of red light on its head which looked like an eyeball. But Brendel knew that it was just the mana core of the enemy. This was the frost demon. It seems that the duration of your cloak is shorter than you expected. You've regressed, Brando. Maynard turned around and pulled out her long sword, standing back to back with Brando. Brando immediately felt awkward. Ever since he transmigrated to this world, his attention had been occupied by other things. As a player, his sharp senses had indeed slowed down a lot. After a scream, 20 to 30 monsters of similar appearance immediately rushed out of the cedar forest, surrounding the two of them. How do we fight? Brando asked. I can deal with 7 or 8 of them, no problem, Maynard said calmly. Then you protect yourself. Leave the rest to me. Maynard nodded. She was very clear about Brando's ability. With her strength, she would only be a burden to him. So, she only needed to protect herself and not distract Brando. As soon as Brando finished speaking, the tip of Haurangaya lightly slashed downwards. With a loud bang, something seemed to rise from the ground. 2 sharp stone spikes pierced through the ground and flew towards the 2 frost demons. Before the latter could react, they were nailed to the cedar tree trunk behind them. With a crack, the cedar tree snapped, and the 2 frost demons were completely smashed into a pile of ice crystals. This happened in an instant, so much so that before the numerous frost monsters could react, they had already lost 2 of their kind. But everyone knew that Haurangaya could only be activated after swinging it. It wasn't that the sword missed, but that Brando hadn't arrived yet. Brando's figure was gradually fading. But on the other side of the battlefield, a black blade appeared in front of a frost demon. That demon raised its head and watched as Haurangaya swept across its body. Like breaking glass, its body of ice shattered inch by inch. Brando's sword seemed to have cut open a gap, creating a huge arc. 3 frost demons were turned into countless flying fragments along with his sword. The shattered frost demons in midair melted at a speed visible to the naked eye. Before their shattered bodies could even land on the ground, they turned into a light blue crystal and fell to the ground. This crystal was a frost core, a very inferior substitute for magic crystals, but it could barely be considered a renewable resource. If Brando had just arrived in Tanajal, such a substitute would have been a precious treasure to him, but now it was of little value. He didn't even look at these drops, and like a whirlwind he charged into the frost demons. In an instant, it seemed as if 4 or 5 Brandos had appeared on the battlefield at the same time. Maynard quickly joined the battle, and the battle was basically one-sided. Only the last few frost demons managed to scratch the female knight with their frost daggers before they died. And it was basically impossible for these monsters to pose any threat to Brando. The last frost demon also turned into ice under Brando's sword. The battle ended in just a few minutes, and Brando didn't even feel that his body had warmed up. However, Maynard had used up a lot of energy. She used all her strength to push away the last frost demon that she killed, and its corpse fell to the ground with a crash, shattering into thousands of pieces. She then leaned on her sword, looking as if it was very strenuous. Brando turned his head, looked at the female knight with a red face and teased, "You've also regressed a lot. Don't compare me to her, I'm not her." Maynard sighed softly and raised her head to glare at him hatefully. Brando smiled faintly. He also knew that Maynard wasn't his senior sister Allium Japonicum, but they seemed to have influenced each other. From her, he could always see the shadow of his senior sister in every detail. He finally understood why, other than her appearance, she always gave him a feeling of closeness. Perhaps it was because of this feeling that it was very difficult for him to bear any ill will towards her, and even had a natural sense of closeness. At this moment, the corpse of the frost demon that Maynard killed was melting, like snow seeping into the meadow, leaving behind a dark blue hexagonal crystal. Brando's smile immediately froze on his face. Maynard also noticed the crystal at her feet. She gently picked it up. "This is the heart of frost." Brendel almost screamed out. "Martha above, how did your face become better?" He looked at the female knight with a dumbfounded expression and blurted out, "This thing's drop rate is only 0.003%. Maynard was slightly startled and immediately glared at him hatefully, replying word by word, "I said I'm not her. But isn't your face still as black as mine?" Brando couldn't help but curse in his heart. When he thought about how this knight captain had opened the corpse a few times before, he still had some lingering fear. "What did you say?" "No, I'm just lamenting." Brando shrugged. Maynard glanced at the gem in her hand. Her gaze was a little confused, but she clearly recognized this thing. She raised the frost heart. "You want this thing? Is it useful to you?" "It's very useful." Brando took a deep breath and answered honestly. "But you're not an elementalist, are you?" "I know, but it's more useful to me than an elementalist," Brando answered. After hearing his answer, Maynard didn't hesitate, as if the thing in her hand was trash to her. She looked at the gem again and then casually threw it over. "Remember, don't compare me to her. I'm me and my name is Maynard." With this action, the female knight coldly ordered. Brando was slightly startled. He suddenly thought of something. "Is this why you don't want to learn magic?" But before he could finish this sentence, Maynard glared at him coldly. "I'm going to treat my wound." The female knight said this and disappeared behind the forest. Brando actually already had an answer in his heart, but he was slightly stunned for a moment before bending down to pick up the frost heart. Opening the interface, a familiar attribute immediately appeared in his vision. Frost heart wind, water elemental pool capacity plus 5%. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Jianghu to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 710. The frost heart wasn't a piece of equipment, nor was it a strengthening crystal. It wasn't a material or an embedded gem. It was a consumable, and its only function was to increase the capacity of the user's wind and water elemental pools by 5%, but it could only be used once on the same person. These things were undoubtedly the spoils of war that Brando needed the most right now. It was also the most crucial part of his path as a planeswalker, something that even Tumen could not imagine. Equipment, special items, consumables for upgrading and strengthening crystals. There were many items in the world of Wone that could expand the elemental pool, like the Heart of Frost and the Star of Flame. Of course, for the sake of balance, except for a small number of divine artifacts and legendary items, similar magic items and fantasy items did not increase the elemental pool too much. But don't forget, Brando himself is special. Because of the existence of the two elemental pools, the enhancement of these items to him was equivalent to double. For example, the Frost Heart's wind and water elemental pools could be expanded by 5%, but for him, it was actually expanded by 10%. A double bonus was enough to change the original balance. Brando even felt that Martha was especially fond of him. Before entering the Stained Frost Forest instance, he had already predicted that he would be able to obtain a similar wind or water elemental pool expansion equipment. After all, this was Erwin's most famous instance with ice-type creatures. However, he didn't think that the surprise would come so quickly. The drop rate of the Frost Heart in the game was only 0.003%. On average, this area would only produce one Frost Heart every 1 to 2 months. However, this time they had only killed 20 to 30 Frost Demons. According to the standards of the game, this was already considered heaven-defying. Most importantly, it was Maynard who had opened it. In Brando's mind, Maynard was basically as bad as his senior. After the Great Happiness, Brando immediately used Frost Heart. The data of the wind and water elemental pools of the two elemental pools immediately became Frowny Face Wind, 2120 plus 1, plus 5%. Wind, 6360 plus 3, plus 5% water, 2120 plus 1, plus 5%. Water, 6360 plus 3, plus 5%. Brando knew that the expansion of the elemental pool was calculated in the game. Equipment, strengthening crystals, and internal enhancement were all calculated separately. Other than the direct increase in the basic value, the other relationships were all multiplicative. Therefore, there was no need to pay too much attention to the order of use. However, after the expansion of the elemental pool, the system prompted that the capacity of his deck had also increased to 6, 10, and 14, 20, which gave him a huge surprise. Because this indirectly confirmed his thoughts. The path he envisioned as a planeswalker was to rely on 8 or more planeswalker creatures to quickly accumulate an absolute advantage on the battlefield. Every planeswalker was a channel for drawing cards and playing cards. One round of drawing cards 10 times and playing cards 10 times. Starting with a hand of 80 cards, what kind of concept was this? Even an apprentice who had just become a planeswalker would understand how terrifying this was. However, the only flaw of his deck was actually the limit of the size of the deck in the elemental pool. After all, Kelsey's idea was flawed. The planeswalker creatures themselves could not provide the capacity of the elemental pool and the deck. This meant that more than 8 planeswalkers would have to draw power from his elemental pool and share only 2 decks. If an ordinary planeswalker's elemental pool and deck could not form a cycle, they would probably face the end of being exhausted in an instant. However, Brando did not want to pursue a cycle in the ordinary sense. If he wanted to pursue a cycle, why did he have to tinker with this deck? Of course, it was not that he had not considered this problem, but he only had a solution. His solution was actually very simple. With the natural advantage of being a high-level player, he could target and collect equipment that could expand the elemental pool. Through the accumulation of equipment and strengthening items, he could support a huge elemental pool. Then, in turn, a huge elemental pool could bring about an equally huge deck. This way he could ingeniously bypass the so-called bottleneck problem of his planeswalker deck. Of course, this method seemed very simple. However, in reality, it was almost impossible for anyone other than Brando. The world of Wond was so huge, and the limited ruins and underground cities were scattered across a vast area. To filter out the equipment that had the attributes you needed from the hundreds of millions of magical equipment, this was undoubtedly a lifetime of work. Of course, you could also make your own. However, ever since the fall of Babel Fortress, most of the skills from the peak of the power of ancient magic had long been lost. Most of the top equipment in the world of Wond were gifts from the ancient times. How could the craftsmanship of the Iron Folk surpass those of the gold and silver bloodlines that were favored by the gods? Not to mention the divine equipment that had been lost in history. They belonged to the gods and were not something that could be born in this era of mortals. However, these problems were not a problem for Brando because this was what he was best at. What equipment was in what instance, which treasure chest hid what he wanted. Finding out these information was as simple as eating and drinking for him. The only pity was that he was a warrior in his previous life and knew little about the top equipment of the wizards. However, he did not expect that this problem would be solved by at least half today. Because his senior sister was once a wizard and an elementalist. After the Frost Heart was used, it disappeared from his hand little by little as if it was weathered. Brando looked at the deck that had just been emptied. He reached out and pulled out a card from the spare deck, Pristine Archangel, and put it into Pahimala's Faith deck. Silver flames immediately ignited on the surface of the card. After the flames burned, the Pristine Archangel immediately changed its appearance. Avenging Angel Faith I Light 15, spells, pay 50 mana and put the Avenging Angel, level equal to Priest Himalud, into the field to attack all enemies that have harmed the summoner. Redemption. When the Avenging Angel enters the field, choose the top 3 cards from the graveyard and shuffle them into their respective decks. Sustain. The Avenging Angel will be maintained until the completion of an attack. The voice of Mass seems to sound from above the clouds, holy light descends from the sky, and the dead are revived. When Brando saw this card he couldn't help but be shocked. Although after he became an official planeswalker, every card that he put into his own rules had to complete a sublimation of the law, it was the first time he had seen a card that had been sublimated to such an extent. He couldn't help but be a little dazed. For a moment he didn't understand where the key point was. However, at this time footsteps came from behind the forest. Maynard was obviously about to return. He hurriedly put away the card, turned around, and saw the bandage wrapped around the female knight's hand. "Are you okay?" he asked with some concern. "Don't worry about it, it's just a small injury," Maynard replied faintly. The female knight came to Brando's side and stood with him by the shining lake. She looked up at the huge island in the center of the lake. There was a broad-leaved forest on the island that was different from other places. Those trees seemed to be oak or mangrove trees, but the trunks and leaves were silver gray, like ice sculptures. The frosty forest stood on the other side of the lake. From afar it looked like a snow-white palace. "The crystal stag is in that forest," Maynard replied. "Do you plan on going there directly?" Brando glanced at the lake that was as smooth as a mirror and shook his head. "I'm afraid it's not that simple. The forest on the other side of the lake should be the Rime Forest. I heard that the crystal stag lives in symbiosis with some ice fairies. Those fairies usually live near the lake. I don't think they'll let us pass so easily." "From what you've said, it seems like you've been prepared for this." Maynard turned around to look at him. Brando nodded. Although his instincts as a player had deteriorated a lot, he would never forget some basic things. For example, he would never forget the detailed investigation and thorough preparation before carrying out a mission. Even if he couldn't find the river of magic in the forest, he had actually prepared some substitute items before meeting up with Maynard. Some magic items similar to the white deer statue could also simulate dark detection abilities, but the effect wouldn't be as good as someone with experience. But let's try it first, he replied after thinking for a moment. Maynard pulled out her sword. Do you want to do it or should I? I'll do it, Brando replied. The ice fairies were level 32 creatures. Although they were still a bit weaker than Maynard, they obviously weren't alone. Plus, the lake was their main battlefield. With that, he lifted the Howran Gaia and slowly stepped into the lake. Just as Maynard said, the lake was very shallow. Most parts of the lake only reached his knees. Although the lake wasn't small, it looked like there was only a shallow surface. In the real world, a scene like this could only be seen in swamps and wetlands. But Wand itself was a world bound by laws, so Brando wasn't surprised to see such a strange scene. It was like if you had seen a river burning with flames, you wouldn't be surprised to see a shallow lake. But Brando had only walked about 20 or 30 meters, and was about 2/3 of the way to the other side of the lake, when he suddenly felt that something was wrong. He lowered his head and saw that the water around him was moving without wind, forming layers of water ripples. What a good way to treat a guest. Brando couldn't help but mutter to himself. He immediately recognized the prelude to a spell, Summon Water Elemental. Reality confirmed his thoughts. The layers of surging ripples seemed to suddenly become violent. In the blink of an eye, a water hill was formed on the surface of the water. Then, with a loud bang, the gathered lake water seemed to have collapsed. A huge giant made purely of lake water rose from the splash. This thing's temper didn't seem to have inherited the gentleness of water. Instead, it was very irritable. It directly threw a water ball at Brando. When Brando saw the diameter of the water ball, he couldn't help but curse in his heart. It was a huge water ball with a diameter of more than 30 meters. Of course, this thing wasn't enough to cause him any harm, but Brando didn't know what those damn ice spirits were going to do next. Once he was hit by this water ball, the ice spirits would definitely use their best ice magic to freeze him in the middle. That scene was like a fly frozen in amber. Brando had seen such a shameless tactic in the game with his own eyes. But what made him even more frustrated was that the originally calm lake started to rise and fall. One after another, water elemental beasts rose from the lake. Looking at it, there were more than 100 of them. F***CK. Brando knew that at least half of these damn water elemental beasts were mirror images. Because it was also a classic water magic, but now he didn't have time to distinguish which ones were real and which ones were fake. Because he didn't want to become a piece of frozen pork. He only took one last look at the direction of the lake and didn't have the slightest intention of continuing to walk in. Martha above, who knew how many ice spirits there were on that island. Such a large area of effect spell wasn't something that could be caused by 100 or 200 ice spirits. Brando didn't even think. He turned around and shouted at Maynard, "Run!" P.S. Today's third chapter is here. It's a little late. I don't know if the last chapter can be updated before 12 o'clock. But forget it, it doesn't matter. Also, a lot of people are asking me who is the Witch King between the Roman and Micaiah. This question made me break out in cold sweat. Isn't this question very simple? The Roman became the Witch King in this world because of Brando, but in the game, Micaiah is the queen in the game. Also, continue to ask for monthly votes, recommendations and all kinds of votes. You know, it's the end of the month, don't think about it anymore. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Jianghu to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.